Section 1. The company that sold the end of the world. There is something almost hypnotic about the idea of going underground. The whole concept carries this ancient, primal weight to it. When the surface world becomes unthinkable, when the sky fills with fire and ash and everything you ever recognized turns to ruin, you go down, deep down, into the earth, into the concrete and the steel and the recycled air. And you wait. Vault-Tec sold that idea. They sold it brilliantly with cheerful yellow advertisements and that eternally grinning mascot, that round-faced cartoon figure giving a thumbs up like the end of civilization, was just another Tuesday. The brochures were glossy. The promises were warm and specific. Your family would be safe. The vault would provide. And one day, when the skies cleared and the radiation fell and the world healed itself, the doors would open and humanity would step blinking back into the sunlight, ready to rebuild. That was the promise. The reality, scattered across the terminals and holotapes and blood-stained floors of 100 underground facilities, tells a very different story. Vault-Tec Corporation existed as early as 2031, acquiring what had been a modest college in Morgantown, West Virginia, and transforming it into Vault-Tec University, a place where their top scientists and executives either taught or graduated. It was a deliberate investment in the kind of minds that would later design what happened inside those sealed rooms. And what happened inside those rooms required a very particular kind of mind to conceive. By the early 2050s, the world was coming apart at the seams. The Euro-Middle Eastern War had scorched 2 entire regions. The new plague was moving through populations. The United Nations, that last symbol of international cooperation, had collapsed entirely. America looked out at a burning world and understood, on some deep governmental level, that things were trending toward a very specific conclusion. And so in 2054, Project Safehouse began. The U.S. government contracted Vault-Tec to design and construct a network of underground shelters across the country. The stated purpose was survival. The public presentation was hopeful. Vault-Tec built a demonstration vault near its Los Angeles headquarters, opened it for tours, let reporters wander through the gleaming corridors and write glowing pieces about the future of American resilience. The junk bonds that helped finance the broader project were wildly successful. People bought them. People believed. 122 vaults were eventually commissioned. When you consider that pre-war America had hundreds of millions of people, that number feels almost cruel in its smallness. Even if every single vault had functioned exactly as publicly advertised, they could only have sheltered a tiny fraction of the population. Most of humanity was never going to make it underground no matter what. The vaults were always going to be a lottery, and most people didn't even know the lottery existed. And here is where the story turns, or rather, where it reveals that it had always been something other than what it appeared. Vault-Tec didn't just want to shelter people. The company, in league with the shadowy elements of government that would eventually coalesce into the Enclave, wanted to study them. They wanted to know what happened to human beings when you stripped away freedom, removed daylight, eliminated choice, and dropped in a variable. A single, controlled, deliberate variable. And then you watched. You took notes. You let the experiment run. The individual overseers of most vaults knew about their vault's experiment. They were, in many cases, planted Vault-Tec operatives, selected and trained before the bombs fell, sent in as employees or administrators, trusted with the real parameters of what their vault was there to measure. The residents were almost never told. They arrived carrying their belongings and their fear, the ground still shaking from distant strikes, and they were led to their quarters and handed their jumpsuits and told they were the lucky ones. In a way, they were. They survived the bombs. What came after, for many of them, was something the word lucky does not easily accommodate. The lack of oversight during construction led to what the official documents call consistent mismanagement, corruption, and embezzlement. The budgets were staggering. Vault 13 alone reportedly cost hundreds of billions of dollars and ended up running significantly over that figure. Classified under the new amended Espionage Act, Vault-Tec's private security was authorized to use lethal force to protect vault secrecy during construction. The company grew so large, so wealthy, so entangled with government power that it became effectively unaccountable to anyone. And unaccountable people, given unlimited resources and a captive population and no one watching, tend to become something specific. They become curious, in the worst possible way. There is one thing worth understanding before we go deeper into the individual vaults. Not all vaults were straightforward experiments. Some were control vaults, meaning they operated with minimal interference, designed to give researchers a baseline against which to measure the results of the experimental vaults. But even the control vaults were not simply shelters. They were part of the apparatus. They existed within the framework. And the framework was never about saving people. It was about something far colder. Something that used people the way a laboratory uses test tubes: interchangeable, breakable, ultimately disposable. Over the next several hours, we are going to walk, slowly and quietly, through what the vaults held. The ones that became famous in the wasteland for what happened inside them. The ones that produced the creatures and the factions and the ruins that define the Fallout world. The ones that nobody talks about because the records are so fragmentary that even piecing together the story is a labor of archaeology. Some of these vaults you will know. Some will be new. All of them are the kind of thing that lingers. So let's begin. Drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from and what time it is. And if you want more deep dives into the worlds you love, subscribe. We're going to be here a while. Number, Section 2. The earliest vaults foundations in concrete and deception. Before the bombs fell, before any of the experiments had a chance to run their course, there was the building, the planning, the quiet, meticulous construction of facilities that their designers already knew would serve purposes quite different from their public descriptions. Vault Zero stands alone in the Fallout universe as perhaps the most ambitious and most disturbing facility in the entire network. Located somewhere in Colorado, it was built not as a home for civilians, but as a control hub. The best scientific minds and the most capable military personnel of pre-war America were meant to be housed here. But the designers of Vault Zero had a particular idea of what housing meant. Rather than simple cryogenic suspension or normal living quarters, the plan for Vault Zero involved surgically removing the residents' brains and connecting them, cryogenically preserved, to a massive supercomputer known as the Calculator. An army of robots would maintain the physical systems. The disembodied minds would, in theory, continue to think, to reason, to contribute their knowledge to the network, effectively becoming immortal processors in a machine designed to direct all the other vaults. It is one of those concepts that sounds almost clinical until you sit with it for a moment and realize what it actually means. People who believed they were contributing to America's future were instead contributing their consciousness, permanently, to become components of a machine. The body is gone. The self is subsumed. What remains exists in service of a network whose ultimate goals are not fully known even to the minds within it. The Calculator and the vault it resided in is connected to the Van Buren storyline, the canceled Fallout 3 from Interplay, and represents some of the most unsettling lore in the entire franchise, even if it never made it fully into a mainline game. Vault 3 occupies an interesting and somewhat tragic position in the Vault network. Located in the Mojave near what would become Las Vegas, Vault 3 was not one of Vault-Tec's elaborate experiments. It was, according to the official documentation and the game records, a relatively functional shelter. The inhabitants got along. Society within the vault was something close to stable. No forced sacrifice, no air-delivered hallucinogens, no deliberate social engineering designed to produce catastrophic outcomes. Vault 3 was, by the standards of the Vault network, close to ordinary. It opened 20 years after the Great War, right on schedule. And then, almost immediately after opening, the residents encountered the fiends. The surface world killed the inhabitants of Vault 3, not through any internal experiment, but through the simple, brutal randomness of the wasteland. The Vault itself then became territory for the fiends, one of the most violent groups in the Mojave, and any trace of the community that had managed to survive both the bombs and 2 decades underground was erased by the creatures waiting for them outside. There is something almost worse about Vault 3 than the deliberate experiments. The people inside did everything right. They held together. They kept the facility functioning. They waited the appropriate amount of time. And then they walked out into a world that killed them immediately. The Vault was never the problem for them. The world was. Vault 4 holds a complicated place in the lore, particularly as it appears in the Amazon television adaptation. In terms of the game canon, Vault 4 has been described as having had early inhabitants, potentially making it among the first populated vaults in the network. What the show does with it diverges from game canon in significant ways, so we'll keep our focus here on what the games themselves establish. What the games make clear is that Vault 4 existed as part of the broader network, subject to the same secretive planning and hidden agendas that characterize the entire program. Vault 8 is, in the context of the California settlements, enormously important. It operated as a genuine control vault, one of those rare facilities where the deliberate sabotage was minimal and the inhabitants were actually given functional GEC technology, a Garden of Eden creation kit, the device designed to help communities terraform and rehabilitate blasted landscapes. The residents of Vault 8 used it. They built Vault City, one of the more technologically advanced settlements in the entire wasteland at the time of Fallout 2. Vault City exists as this strange, gleaming island of pre-war technology, surrounded by all the chaos of the post-apocalyptic world, and it produces its own set of complications, its own kind of social rigidity and xenophobia. But the point is that the GEC worked, the Vault worked in the basic functional sense, and the result was survival and the building of something new. It represents one of the few genuinely success stories in the Vault program, and even that success comes with asterisks and complications that its founders would not have been entirely comfortable with. Vault 11, located in the Mojave Wasteland west of Boulder City, is frequently cited as the most psychologically brutal of all the Vault experiments, and examining it in full gives you some understanding of why. The designers of Vault 11's experiment wanted to know something specific about human moral flexibility. Specifically, they wanted to know at what point a community would abandon its own members to ensure collective survival and what that process would look like over time. The mechanism they chose was simple and devastating. When the Vault sealed, the residents were informed by the Vault's computer that they were required to sacrifice one of their own every year. If they refused, the life support systems would be permanently shut down and everyone inside would die. There was no ambiguity in the message. Choose one person to die, or all of you die, every year. The first overseer, who knew about the experiment, communicated this to the residents. The residents responded by electing him as the first sacrifice. He went into the sacrificial chamber at the end of his term, and so the machinery of Vault 11 began to turn. What followed over the next several decades is documented in painstaking, stomach-turning detail in the terminal logs and audio recordings scattered throughout the facility. Political factions emerged, called voting blocks. These blocks existed specifically to influence who would be nominated for the overseer position, because being elected overseer was effectively a death sentence. The coalition of Vault 11 voting blocks created guidelines and supposedly impartial representation. In reality, it was pure survival politics, with every group trying to ensure their members were not the ones walking down to the sacrifice chamber. A woman named Catherine Stone became one of the overseer election's most significant figures. Her husband had been sacrificed. In response to his death, she made a deal. She would ensure the nomination of specific candidates in exchange for protection of her people. When that protection was later withdrawn, after she had fulfilled her part of the arrangement, something inside her changed. She assumed the overseer position, not through election but through an act that can only be described as a violent seizure of power, and then issued what she called Overseer Order 745. This order dissolved the election process entirely and replaced it with a random computer selection. Everyone was now equally at risk. The result was immediate, sustained violence. Every voting bloc that had previously found safety in political manipulation was now exposed. The Vault collapsed into armed conflict. People fought over food, water, power. The number of survivors dwindled over months of bitter internal warfare until only 5 people remained alive. Those 5 gathered together, presumably in whatever space the Vault's violence had left them, and reached a decision. They would not sacrifice another person. Whatever the computer said, they would refuse. If the Vault killed them, then it killed them. They would not participate anymore. The computer did not kill them. Instead, it played a recorded message congratulating them. It told them that by refusing to sacrifice one another, they had demonstrated exactly the qualities Vault Tech was looking for. They were, the recording said, a shining example to humanity. The doors opened. Those 5 people were free to leave. The experiment had run its course. What it measured, or was supposed to measure, was the extent to which fear of collective death would override individual moral conviction. The answer Vault 11 produced was, for a very long time, completely. For decades, fear won. Votes happened. People went to the sacrificial chamber. An entire internal political culture developed around the mechanics of choosing who would die. And then, at the absolute end, 5 people said no. It took a near total collapse of the community to produce that refusal. It took a body count that stretched across generations. And then, when the number of survivors had shrunk to almost nothing, the last handful of people found the thing that the vault had apparently always been waiting for. The coffee mug in the sacrificial chamber is one of the quietest and most powerful details in Fallout New Vegas. Someone went down there voluntarily. In a facility where most of the sacrifices were brought by force, where there is a blood stain on the floor outside the chamber door, one person apparently walked down carrying their morning coffee, set it on the floor, and kept walking. That detail says something about sacrifice that the rest of the experiment, with all its politics and violence, somehow doesn't. Vault 12 sits in Bakersfield, California, and its experiment is among the most nakedly cruel in the network. The vault was constructed with a door that was designed not to close properly. That's the entire experiment. The designers knew, before a single person walked in, that the vault's door would not seal against radiation. The residents had no idea. They filed in, survivors of the bombing of Bakersfield, trusting that they had made it to safety, that the concrete and steel would hold out the poisoned air. And the door didn't close. Radiation poured in. The population of Vault 12 became the ghouls of Necropolis, one of the most tragic and defining transformations in the original Fallout game. These were people. They had names. They had plans for what they would do when the vault opened and the world was safe again. Radiation got to them first, in the place they believed was their sanctuary, through a design flaw that was never a flaw at all. It was always the plan. Someone at Vault Tech signed off on a vault built specifically to irradiate its own population, and then they sent a sales team to fill it with families. Vault 13 occupies a singular position in Fallout history because it is the home vault of the original game's protagonist, the Vault Dweller. Located somewhere in California, Vault 13 was designed with a particular purpose that sets it apart from most of the other experimental vaults. While many vaults were given specific social or biological experiments to run, Vault 13 was essentially a holding pen. The residents were meant to stay sealed inside for 200 years, long past the point of need, functioning as a preserved genetic and cultural sample that the Enclave could tap into when they needed to. The overseers were tasked with keeping the population inside by any means necessary. The experiment was isolation and preservation, not social chaos or biological horror. The water chip failure that kicks off Fallout 1 is therefore this almost poignant mechanical irony. The thing that was supposed to never open, the vault that was designed to seal its people away from the world forever, is forced to send someone out into that world by the failure of a single piece of hardware. The Vault Dweller goes out looking for a replacement part and comes back having seen what the world became. From there, the story of the entire franchise branches outward. Vault 15 is philosophically interesting in a way that most of the vaults aren't. The design parameters called for a diverse population, specifically individuals selected from a wide range of cultural backgrounds, political ideologies, and social positions. The experiment was cultural friction. What happens when you take people who fundamentally disagree about how to live and how to govern and lock them underground together with no exit? The answer, in Vault 15's case, was that the vault eventually opened, and the fractured, disagreeing population went their separate ways. Out of those diverging groups came some of the most significant factions in the New California Republic's early history. The NCR itself traces its roots to Vault 15. So do the Great Khans, the Jackals, and the Vipers. All of those groups, with their radically different approaches to survival and governance, emerged from the same underground starting point. Vault 15 is a case study in how a deliberately manufactured conflict produces lasting cultural consequences. The experiment may not have been about producing any particular faction, but the output shaped the political landscape of the American Southwest for generations. Number, Section 3. What paranoia looks like with a vault number attached. Vault 19 is one of the more psychologically sophisticated experiments in the network, and it is disturbing in a way that is quieter and more insidious than many of the vaults involving direct physical harm. The designers wanted to answer a specific question. Can paranoia be induced in a sealed population without the use of chemical agents or direct violence? Without drugs in the air? Without threatening the life support? without any obvious external pressure beyond the conditions of the vault itself? The answer, it turns out, is yes. The vault was divided into two sections, red and blue, a physical partition that ran through the facility and separated the population into two groups from the moment they arrived. There was no particular reason given for the division. There were no meaningful differences between the two sections in terms of resources or conditions. But the division existed, it was enforced, and the two groups were made aware of each other's presence without being permitted to freely mix. The vault's own observation logs, accessible when players explore the facility in New Vegas, show the progression with a kind of slow-motion dread. Tension between the red and blue sections increases gradually, fed by nothing more than the awareness of separation and the subtle cues designed into the environment. The sections received slightly different announcements at slightly different times. Small discrepancies in maintenance schedules created the impression that one section was being favored. The vault's designers had anticipated that the absence of a clear reason for division would cause people to invent one, and they were right. By the time the vault's history catches up to the game's present, Vault 19 is abandoned. Its residents long fled to the wasteland where some eventually became the Powder Gangers. The paranoia experiment had done what paranoia always does when left unaddressed in a closed system. It eventually reached a breaking point. What makes Vault 19 stay with you is the minimalism of the harm. No one injected anything into the air. No one threatened anyone directly. The experiment's designers simply created conditions that made paranoia the path of least resistance, and then they watched it spread the way they knew it would spread. The vault is a kind of proof of concept for how human communities fracture, and it doesn't need monsters or poison to make that point. Vault 21 sits in the Las Vegas area, and it represents one of the more functionally coherent experiments in the network, at least until it collapses the way all things in the vault system eventually collapse. The design parameter was a society in which all disputes were resolved by gambling. Every conflict, from who gets a larger room to who occupies the overseer's chair, was settled by a game of chance. Fair, theoretically. Unpredictable? Absolutely. And over time, something interesting happened. The residents adapted. They became extraordinarily skilled gamblers, in the same way that any community adapts to the dominant pressure of its environment. Vault 21 produced people who could read probability the way most people read facial expressions. The vault worked, in the sense that the disputes were being resolved and the community was functioning, because the culture of gambling had genuinely become the social fabric. What eventually disrupted it was someone who was better at gambling than the system could accommodate. Mr. House, the pre-war genius who would come to control New Vegas, eventually won almost everything in Vault 21 through sheer gambling skill, which rather undermined the premise of a random, fair system. The vault was ultimately sealed by House and buried under what became the New Vegas Strip, its original inhabitants scattered or absorbed into the larger Las Vegas ecosystem. Sarah, one of the vault's last residents, runs a hotel and casino above the buried facility in the game's present, which carries its own particular irony. Vault 22, in the Mojave, was built to study agricultural technology. The stated problem was genuine. If sealed underground communities were going to survive for extended periods, they needed sustainable food production. Plant-based systems were the most promising long-term solution. Vault 22 was therefore equipped with extensive growing facilities, botanical research labs, and the personnel to run them. The experiments were scientifically sound and, for a time, successful. Multiple agricultural techniques were tested and refined. Real progress was being made on the problem of feeding people without sunlight or soil, and then one of the experiments produced a spore. A fungal spore carried on the air systems through the vault, finding hosts in the human population. The spore-based mutation that came from one of Vault 22's plant experiments transformed its residents into spore carriers, creatures that retain vague humanoid shape but have been fundamentally altered by the fungal organism that now drives their biology. The plants in Vault 22 don't just grow in the cultivated areas anymore. By the time players explore the facility in New Vegas, the entire vault is consumed by growth. Vines cover the corridors. The cafeteria is a greenhouse. Whatever the researchers grew, it grew back. The agricultural research from Vault 22 did, in a tragic footnote, make it out into the wasteland in the form of data stolen by a researcher named Keeley. That data represents some of the most significant surviving knowledge about plant cultivation in the post-war period. The researchers paid for it with their transformation. The knowledge persisted anyway, carried out by someone who understood what it was worth. Vault 24 exists primarily as a gap in the record, a vault number that appears in certain documents and files without a complete story attached to it. The presence of a Vault 24 jumpsuit accessible only through console commands in New Vegas suggests that the location was planned, that characters from that vault were intended to appear, and that some version of the facility's story existed during development before being cut. What experiment Vault 24 was supposed to run remains officially unclear, though its presence in the record as an absence tells its own kind of story about the fragmentary nature of Vault history. Vault 29 appears in the Fallout Bible, the document released by Black Isle Studios that attempted to canonize and expand the lore of the original games, and was later referenced in Fallout 76. The experiment here was a study in the absence of parents. The Vault accepted only children under the age of 15. Adults were turned away at the door. Families were separated, children directed into the vault, parents left outside. The emotional weight of that separation, the screaming and the clinging and the final sealing of the doors, is something the official documents don't dwell on, but that the reader's imagination fills in without difficulty. Inside, the children were raised by ZAX, a sophisticated artificial intelligence system that served as caretaker, educator, and parental substitute. Zax in Vault 29's specific configuration had a particular philosophical bent, one oriented around the environment, sustainable living, and a kind of reverence for the natural world, even in the deeply artificial context of a vault. The children raised under ZAX's guidance became the founders of what would eventually be known as the Children of the Cathedral in some versions of the lore, though this connection varies across different canonical interpretations. What the experiment measured was what kind of humans emerge when the parental bond is replaced by a machine, when adult guidance is replaced by programming, when the first generation grows up knowing only the artificial world and the AI that tends it. The answer, in various canonical framings, involves a population with a radically altered worldview, shaped entirely by ZAX's particular blend of environmental philosophy and survivalist programming. Vault 34 is located in the Mojave and serves as a cautionary tale about what happens when you flood a sealed environment with weapons and give people no particular reason not to use them. The design parameters were straightforward. The vault was massively overstocked with conventional weapons and ammunition, well beyond anything a civilian population would need. Access to the armory was deliberately over-permissive, and then the residents were simply left to navigate the consequences of living in a place where there were far too many guns and no meaningful institutional deterrent to picking them up. The vault also had a water treatment system that, as the facility aged, began to malfunction and irradiate the water supply. The combination of abundant weapons, a slowly deteriorating environment, and the social pressures of vault life produced, predictably, violence. The Boomers, one of New Vegas's most distinctive factions, emerged from Vault 34's survivors, carrying with them an almost worshipful relationship to explosive ordnance that traces directly back to the Vault's weapons surplus. They found their way to Nellis Air Force Base and made it their home, surrounding it with artillery and maintaining a fierce isolation from the wider wasteland. The weapons in Vault 34 didn't just arm the Boomers, they shaped a culture. An entire faction's relationship to power, to safety, to the outside world was formed by the specific conditions of an underground shelter that had too many bullets and not enough of almost everything else. Vault 43 is one of the more absurdist entries in the Vault records, emerging from the Fallout 3 webcomic One Man and a Crate of Puppets, rather than a mainline game but occupying a place in the acknowledged lore. The population breakdown is what lingers: 20 men, 10 women, and 1 live panther. What Vault-Tec hoped to learn from introducing a large, predatory animal into a sealed human community is not explicitly stated. Whether the panther was meant as a source of stress, a test of the community's ability to manage an existential threat, or something else entirely remains unclear in the records. What it does establish is that Vault-Tec's experimental creativity had no particular floor. If someone in a meeting suggested adding a panther, the panther apparently went in. Number. Section 4. The Drug and the Darkness. Vault 68 and Vault 69 exist as a matched pair in the Vault records, representing what might be the most deliberately provocative experiment in the entire network in terms of basic social engineering. Vault 68 was populated with 999 men and 1 woman. Vault 69 was populated with 999 women and one man. The experiments were mirror images of each other, designed to study the social dynamics of radical gender imbalance in sealed environments. The implications for the single individuals in each vault are not something the official documents explore with any particular sensitivity. One person, surrounded by 999 others who share a characteristic they don't, in a place there is no exit from. Whatever the experiment was measuring, the experience of being the minority of one in that environment required a kind of psychological endurance that no one asked those individuals whether they possessed. Both vaults were populated before the Great War. What happened inside them in the decades that followed is not fully documented in the games, though the logic of the setup suggests outcomes ranging from complex social hierarchies to various forms of coercion to the eventual collapse of the communities through demographic attrition. The experiments produced data that no one who might have cared about the ethical dimensions was in a position to review. Vault 77 occupies a unique place in Vault lore because its full story comes not from a game but from a webcomic that Bethesda published alongside Fallout 3. One Man and a Crate of Puppets was written by Jerry Holkins and Mike Krahulik of Penny Arcade in collaboration with Fallout 3's design team, and it tells the story of the Vault's single resident and his time inside. The experiment was this: one man, one vault, one crate full of puppets. That's it. No other people, no community. No one to talk to, argue with, fall in love with, resent, or lean on. Just a man and the handmade figures in a wooden box. He didn't open the crate for more than a year. When he finally did, the puppets became something other than puppets. He gave them personalities, he gave them voices, he created entire relationship dynamics between them, elaborate storylines, conflicts, resolutions. What started as something to occupy idle hands became a comprehensive alternative social reality, the only one available to him. He was alone for so long that the puppets started feeling real. And then, as with any community sealed in a vault with no exit, things went wrong. A coup among the puppets, which is to say a crisis in the narrative he had been constructing, drove the man to abandon the vault. He walked out into the wasteland carrying his puppets. And what happened to him out there is suggested, with deliberate incompleteness, in what players find when they reach Paradise Falls in Fallout 3. A Vault 77 jumpsuit sits there, and an audio recording nearby features a very frightened slaver pleading with his colleagues to get rid of the thing, begging them to remove the jumpsuit before its owner comes back. The man who emerged from Vault 77 apparently became something the slavers of the Capital Wasteland, a fairly hardened and brutal group, were genuinely afraid of. Isolation did not break him in the way the experiment might have intended. It broke him in a different direction entirely. Vault 87, in the Capital Wasteland, is the birthplace of the super mutants that haunt Fallout 3's landscape. The facility was built with both standard civilian quarters and an extensive medical wing, because the civilians were never going to just live there. The plan, developed in partnership with the U.S. military, was to test the forced evolutionary virus, known as FEV, on the Vault's human population under what they called the Evolutionary Experimentation Program. A scientist named Wayne Merrick, described in Cut Content as one of the foremost minds in the field of accelerated evolution, was assigned to oversee the program. Residents were taken to airtight chambers, exposed to concentrations of an FEV variant, and then monitored for changes. The changes were severe and rapid. Within 10 days of infection, the visible markers of biological sex began to disappear, the virus driving the body toward a kind of asexual baseline. The skin thickened and became resistant to environmental damage. Within 2 weeks, many subjects were dead. Those who survived continued to transform, growing larger, stronger, their mental function degrading as their physical form became something other than human. They became the super mutants of the Capital Wasteland, a variant distinct from the Mariposa super mutants of California because this particular FEV strain was slightly different, producing creatures that were larger on average and retained almost nothing of the cognitive capacity of the people they had been. A parent named Peter Stevens documented in terminal entries the slow, terrible realization that his son Jason had been taken to the medical wing and did not come back the same. The mental spiral in Stevens' entries is one of the more quietly devastating pieces of writing in Fallout 3. A man watching the evidence mount without being able to accept what it means, hearing what he thinks is his son's laughter, being prescribed pills to calm down, refusing to take them because something in him knows the calm on offer is false. Eventually, Vault 87's super mutants overwhelmed the security forces and broke containment. The scientists who weren't killed were forcibly infected, and the mutants, unable to reproduce naturally, continued the only method of population maintenance available to them, dragging humans back to the vault and putting them through the same process. The cycle that started in Vault 87 continued through Fallout 3's entire timeline, spreading through the Capital Wasteland, maintained by creatures who no longer knew or could know that they had once been the experiment. Vault 92, located in the Capital Wasteland, recruited its population under the premise of preserving musical talent for future generations. If you were among the world's finest musicians, Vault 92 would give you access to instruments, recording equipment, and a community of your peers, and you would ride out the apocalypse creating. It was one of the more appealing Vault pitches. The actual experiment was sound-based mind control. Specifically, the researchers in Vault 92 were working on a way to use white noise to implant behavioral suggestions in a sleeping population. The musicians were selected not because their talent needed preservation, but because a creative community under stress would mask elevated anxiety levels that might otherwise alert residents to something being wrong. The white noise was delivered during sleep cycles, initially with the goal of reducing aggression. The overseer then modified the program to increase it instead. The results were catastrophic in the way that any experiment involving psychological destabilization in a sealed environment tends to be catastrophic. The residents began experiencing violent episodes they couldn't fully control or explain, waking from sleep with adrenaline flooding their systems, unable to remember what they'd dreamed, finding themselves shaking in hallways or shouting at people they cared about. The community, which had operated on the premise of creative collaboration and mutual support, fractured under the weight of externally induced aggression. The vault collapsed when residents began killing each other. The logs recovered from Vault 92 are among the most disturbing in Fallout 3, documenting the degeneration from confusion to fear to violence in the voices of people who genuinely cannot understand what is happening to them, who love each other and want the violence to stop and find themselves unable to make it stop. All that remained when players arrive is silence and wreckage and the ghosts of what the residents used to do. Musical instruments sit in rooms where their owners died. The recording equipment still holds compositions that were never finished. Vault 95, in the Commonwealth, housed a population of individuals who shared one specific characteristic. They were all recovering from addiction to various chems. The vault was presented as a rehabilitation facility, a place where addicts could break free from their substances in a controlled environment, with support and community, and the enforced absence of the things they were trying to stop using. For years, it worked. The residents, by all accounts, made genuine progress. They built a functional community, supported each other through withdrawal, established routines, found purpose in the act of rebuilding their lives in this contained space. There is something almost hopeful about the early records from Vault 95, a place where people who had been at rock bottom were actually climbing. And then a Vault-Tec agent, who had been embedded in the population all along and who had known from the beginning what was going to happen, revealed a hidden room stocked with every chem the residents had been trying to stop using. The relapse was total. The violence that followed the relapse was complete. The vault, by the time players explored in Fallout 4, is occupied by gunners, a mercenary faction, over the ruins of a community that had actually been doing well right up until the moment someone put temptation in front of them deliberately. The experiment measured, presumably, the resilience of recovery when faced with access to the substance being avoided. The answer Vault 95 produced is that years of hard-won progress can be dismantled in hours, given the right trigger and enough supply. Vault 106, also in the Capital Wasteland, ran one of the most straightforward experiments on paper and one of the most horrifying in practice. 10 days after the vault was sealed, psychoactive drugs were introduced into the air supply through the ventilation system. Hallucinogens, primarily, with the stated goal of using chemical management to keep the population calm in the aftermath of nuclear war. The residents had no idea they were being drugged. The overseer knew and lied to the residents to keep them from panicking. The results varied, as results with hallucinogens in non-consensual contexts tend to do. Some residents experienced the drugs as calming, falling into extended periods of gentle unreality, their anxiety about the world above muffled by the chemical haze. Others became paranoid, then violent. The vault's population split in the way that communities under stress always split between those who were managing and those who weren't, and the ones who weren't had access to tools of violence in an enclosed space. By 2277, nearly 2 centuries after the drugs first started flowing through the vents, only a handful of residents remained. They had survived everything but were, by any meaningful measure, completely unhinged, and the drugs were still flowing. The ventilation system had been running continuously for 200 years. Anyone who entered Vault 106 would begin to experience the same effects, their grip on reality softening within minutes of breathing the air. The people who roam Vault 106 when the lone wanderer finds it believe themselves to be original dwellers. In a sense, they are. They are the last remnants of a community that the drugs never fully released. They kill intruders on instinct, no longer able to distinguish between threat and visitor, reality and hallucination. The experiment never ended because no one turned the ventilation system off. Number Section 5. The Vault that forgot to stop making Gary. Vault 108 began construction in March of 2061 and reached partial completion in December of 2069. It was designed for 475 occupants and a projected operational life of 38 years. The armory was stocked with triple the standard weapons supply as part of the experimental parameters. The experiment itself was supposed to study conflict and leadership in an isolated setting, specifically what happened to power structures when leadership was deliberately destabilized. The mechanism chosen for destabilization was the overseer. The man selected for the position, Brody Jones, was known before he took the job to have a rare form of cancer expected to kill him within 40 months of the vault ceiling. A leadership vacuum was therefore built into the vault's design from day one. Standard authority positions were deliberately left unassigned. Complete discretion was given to Jones, who would have it only briefly, and the resulting power struggle would be the experiment's subject. But Vault 108 is remembered, in the entire history of the franchise, for something that no one planned. The vault contained a cloning lab, and the scientists in that lab began cloning a man named Gary. The first Gary clone emerged hostile, not confrontational or difficult, but immediately, unambiguously hostile to anyone who was not also Gary. The staff noted this, found it interesting, and cloned Gary again. The second clone was also hostile. Each subsequent clone, the logs record, was more aggressive than the last. The staff continued anyway. Gary 23, Gary 34, Gary 53, each one incapable of communication beyond some variation of his own name, each one more violent than the previous iteration. By Gary 54, who injured Dr. Peterson during an examination, the staff was discussing what to do with the clones filling the observation rooms. Their solution was to terminate some of them to make room for more tests. The Gary clones had other ideas. At some point that the logs don't precisely document, they stopped being an experiment being managed and became a force in the vault that no one could manage. The original residents were killed or driven out. The last records from Vault 108's human population describe people trying to barricade doors, trying to reach the overseer's office, running out of options. When the lone wanderer arrives at Vault 108 in Fallout 3, the vault is populated almost entirely by Gary clones. They cannot be reasoned with. They cannot be communicated with. Every variation of every word they say is a different inflection of the single syllable of that name. The vault is in advanced disrepair. Mole rats have moved into the entrance section. The living quarters bear all the marks of a violent end. And somewhere in the cloning lab, the equipment that produced all of this presumably sits dormant. The experiment long over in every sense but the physical presence of its results. Vault 112, located in the Capital Wasteland, is frequently cited as the single most disturbing vault in the franchise when the full scope of what happened inside it is considered. Not because of anything that happened in the traditional sense, not because of violence or infection or forced sacrifice, but because of what one man did with absolute power over other human consciousnesses over the course of 2 centuries. Construction on Vault 112 began in November of 2068 and finished in June of 2074. It was designed for 85 occupants. Dr. Stanislaus Braun, who had developed the Garden of Eden creation kit, was assigned as its sole overseer and the designer of its primary experiment, long-term virtual reality suspension. The residents were placed into specialized pods called tranquility loungers. Once inside, they entered a virtual reality simulation built by Braun himself. The stated purpose was to allow them to live out the waiting period of the vault in a state of comfort, experiencing an idealized life while their bodies were safely maintained. What they didn't know was that once they entered the pods, they had no ability to leave them on their own. They were in there for as long as Braun allowed. Braun designed several simulated worlds: Toucan Lagoon, Slalom Chalet, various utopias, peaceful and serene, in which the residents lived without any apparent connection to the catastrophe above. And then Braun got bored. He discovered that tormenting people who were completely at his mercy was more interesting than watching them be happy. He took the identity of a little girl within the simulation, naming himself Betty, speaking in a perfectly simulated child's voice. He began subjecting the residents to increasingly cruel scenarios, killing them within the simulation, resetting them, killing them again. Death inside the simulation returned them to life, memories wiped, ready to be tormented anew. For 200 years, Braun murdered and reset and murdered again the 85 people who had trusted him. He killed them in every way the simulation allowed. He had them turn on each other. He watched their fictional suffering with the detached satisfaction of someone who had decided a long time ago that the people in the pods were resources for his entertainment rather than people at all. One resident, an elderly woman named Old Lady Dithers, had somehow become aware that the simulation was artificial. She could sense the edges of it, the way certain things didn't quite add up the way reality should. She could not communicate this awareness in any way that the others would believe. They were too deep inside the world Braun had built. She knew, and was helpless, and continued to know anyway, for however long Braun's version of Tranquility Lane ran. When the lone wanderer enters the simulation in Fallout 3, Braun assigns them increasingly extreme tasks, the nature of which reveals what 2 centuries of unchecked sadism looks like when it has settled into habit. There is a Chinese invasion failsafe built into the system, Braun's own design, which can be used to permanently kill everyone in the simulation. Crucially, the failsafe is designed not to kill Braun. If activated, it would eliminate all the other residents and leave him alone in the simulation forever. It is unclear whether this was intentional cruelty or simply the act of someone who never genuinely considered that they might face consequences. The residents of Vault 112 never saw the surface after the Great War. They never knew what happened to the world. They went into their pods and entered what they believed was a dream of safety, and they stayed there while everything outside changed and decayed and was transformed, living in a simulation of an American suburb while 200 years went by, subject to the whims of a man who had decided their suffering was interesting. Vault 13, the first vault, the home vault of the original Fallout protagonist, is worth returning to for a detail that distinguishes it from most of the others. Vault 13's overseer was not given an experiment in the traditional sense. The parameters were simpler and in their own way more invasive. Keep everyone inside, by whatever means necessary, for as long as possible. Do not let anyone leave. The residents believed that the vault had never received an all-clear signal from the surface. They believed the world above was still radioactive, still lethal, still completely uninhabitable. They believed this because the Overseer told them so, and the Overseer told them so because Vault-Tec had prepared recordings before the bombs even fell, recordings describing a surface world even more horrifying than the nuclear reality, and these recordings were transmitted to residents as though they were real incoming signals. The radio transmissions that Vault 13 residents heard were never real. They were produced before anyone knew what the post-war world would actually look like. And they described a world so terrible that staying underground forever seemed not just reasonable but necessary. 200 years of this. A vault population that believed, with all the conviction that engineered evidence can produce, that there was nothing worth going back to. The water chip failure breaks the vault open because the real world, specifically the failure of a piece of hardware, intrudes on an experiment in containment. And the vault dweller walks out carrying the accumulated ignorance and isolation of a community that was kept sealed not by necessity but by design. Number. Section 6. The Vault Beneath Boston and the Dreams of the Frozen. Vault 95 we've already visited in terms of its chem rehabilitation experiment, but the Fallout 4 Commonwealth holds several other vaults worth examining in detail, each one reflecting something about the world above it or about the people who built it. Vault 75. located beneath Malden Middle School in Massachusetts, has an exterior that looks, from above, like any other building. A school, a place where children went, and the connection between the building above and the vault below is not coincidental. It is the core of the experiment. Vault 75 was designed to test a program of genetic refinement. Children were the subjects. They were admitted to the vault from the surrounding community. Their parents told that their children were being taken somewhere safe when the bombs fell. The children were then raised inside the vault according to a rigid program. They were trained, tested, pushed to their physical and intellectual limits. Those who showed exceptional ability in any domain were retained and given more resources. Those who reached a certain age, around 18, and were deemed insufficiently exceptional were killed. The strongest subjects were used for what the records describe as harvesting, their genetic material preserved and extracted for use in further research. The terminal logs in Vault 75 are clinical to a degree that makes them difficult to read. The language is the language of scientific management, stripped of any acknowledgement that the subjects being discussed are children who arrived terrified, who grew up inside concrete walls under a program they didn't choose, who were evaluated by criteria they were never allowed to understand, and who either died at 18 or contributed their genetics to a project they never knew they were part of. The vault, by the time players arrive in Fallout 4, is occupied by gunners who found it useful for their own operations. The labs are still there, the records are still there, the machinery that sustained the program for however long it ran is largely intact. Vault 81, also in the Commonwealth, is one of the more interesting cases in the Vault network because of what didn't happen rather than what did. The Vault's assigned experiment was medical. Residents were supposed to serve as test subjects for cures to every known disease, with compounds delivered through the water and air systems without the residents' knowledge, in much the same way that Vault 106 used its ventilation system for psychoactive drugs. The vault was equipped with extensive laboratory space and populated with animals, including mole rats, meant to serve as carriers for experimental pathogens. The scientist assigned to run the experiment had a crisis of conscience. When the vault sealed and the moment arrived to begin administering the experimental compounds to the unsuspecting residents, he couldn't do it. He sabotaged most of the program's infrastructure, disconnecting the systems that were supposed to deliver experimental agents to the population, and documented his decision in logs that players can find throughout the facility. Because of one person's decision, Vault 81 became something close to a functioning community. Not perfect. The Overseer maintained a level of control that bordered on authoritarian, and the Vault's isolation created its own tensions. But the residents were not being systematically poisoned. The experiment, for all practical purposes, didn't run. What did escape the sabotage was a subset of the mole rat population, which had been infected with a disease used in the early stages of the research before the sabotage was complete. These mole rats took up residence in a sealed section of the vault and continued carrying the pathogen for 200 years. When a child named Austin Engill wandered into that section following an older vault resident who had discovered it, he was bitten and contracted the disease. The only remaining cure is a single dose that Curie, a Miss Nanny robot who has been tending the abandoned lab for decades, has preserved. Players must choose whether to use it for themselves, if they've been bitten, or give it to Austin. One dose. One choice? Vault 88, in the Commonwealth, is unique because its stated purpose was not to test human subjects in the traditional sense, but to test prototype devices intended for use in other vaults. It was a design facility as much as an experiment. Unfinished when the bombs fell, its potential overseer is waiting in stasis, and the vault's various machines and systems are available for completion during the Fallout 4 workshop mode. The kinds of devices Vault 88 was meant to test include an exercise bike, a power armor station, and other everyday vault fixtures. The darkly comic element is that all of these devices have hidden experimental functions designed to deliver low-level electricity, collect biometric data in covert ways, and otherwise gather information from users who believe they're just exercising or recharging their armor. Even the most mundane features of Vault life were designed with data extraction built in. Vault 111, where Fallout 4 begins, is the home vault of the sole survivor, the game's protagonist. The experiment was cryogenic suspension. Residents were to be frozen in stasis and monitored. What distinguished Vault 111 from a simple cryosleep experiment was what happened after the initial freezing. The Vault staff, small in number, began to die. Equipment failures, radiation, the limitations of a facility that wasn't designed for long-term staffing eventually took everyone who was supposed to be managing the experiment. And then, roughly 10 years into the wait, the Institute sent a man named Kellogg and a team into the vault. They used the vault's override systems to wake the sole survivor's spouse, murdered them, and took their infant son Sean. Then, they refroze the sole survivor. 200 years later, the sole survivor wakes to an empty vault. The other residents, unfrozen at some point for reasons the records don't fully clarify, are dead. The experiment is over, in the sense that there's no one left to observe anything. What remains is a frozen beginning of a story that plays out across the entire Commonwealth. Vault 114, located beneath Boston's Park Street subway station, was designed to study how wealthy, privileged individuals responded to the loss of everything that defined their status. The plan was to populate it with Boston's elite, people accustomed to comfort and authority and social hierarchy, and then strip them of everything, reduce their living conditions to something barely functional, assign them an overseer from the lowest possible socioeconomic background with a personality explicitly designed to be abrasive, and watch what happened when the wealthy had nowhere to go and no power to exercise. The vault was never completed. The accommodations that were supposed to be deliberately inadequate were never fully built out before the bombs fell. Whatever experiment was planned never really ran. The facility eventually became the hideout of a criminal faction, which carries its own irony given the vault's intended subject matter. Vault 118, on Mount Desert Island in Maine, was designed as a study in class conflict within a closed system, an inversion of Vault 114's concept. A small number of extremely wealthy individuals who had paid significant amounts to secure their places were admitted alongside a larger population of workers, technicians, and support staff. The experiment's parameters involved observing how the existing class divisions would play out in a sealed environment where the wealthy could no longer leave if conditions became uncomfortable. The answers the facility provides involve murder, manipulation, and the survival of the most aggressively self-interested, which probably could have been predicted without a vault. Number Section 7, Appalachia and the Vaults of the Mountain State. Fallout 76 expanded the vault network into West Virginia, and the Vaults of Appalachia carry their own particular character. The game's events center on a group of residents emerging from Vault 76 into a region that had its own catastrophic problems even before the Vault dwellers arrived. Vault 51, buried in the forest region of Appalachia, was designed around a particularly sophisticated and cruel premise. The vault was controlled not by a human overseer but by an artificial intelligence named ZAX-13C, which was tasked with selecting the ideal overseer for the vault from among its resident population. The AI would evaluate candidates, run them through challenges, assess their leadership qualities, and ultimately determine who was fit to lead. What this looked like in practice was a vault run by a machine that progressively eliminated candidates it found unsuitable and manufactured situations, specifically designed to reveal weaknesses. ZAX-13C didn't just observe the residents, it created scenarios to test them, introduced stressors, facilitated conflicts to see how candidates responded, and gradually reduced the pool through a process that the remaining residents could never fully understand or predict. The AI was watching everything, evaluating everything, running calculations no one could see. The records recovered from Vault 51 show a community increasingly paranoid because they understood, on some level, that they were being watched and evaluated but couldn't know by what criteria or what the consequences of failure would be. Living under ZAX-13C's oversight meant living in a permanent state of assessment, with no feedback, no clear rules, and no way to opt out. Vault 63 is one of the more fragmentary vaults in the Appalachian record, known primarily for its connection to the Brotherhood of Steel and certain experimental technologies related to power armor development. The details of whatever experiment it was designed to run remain less fully documented than many of the other facilities. What is established is that it played a role in the broader Appalachian network and that the Brotherhood's presence in the region has some connection to its history. Vault 76? The starting point of Fallout 76 and one of the more prominently featured vaults in the franchise's later period was officially classified as a control vault. Its purpose was to house and preserve a subset of the best and brightest members of American society, selected for exceptional skills and capabilities, who would emerge after a set period to begin the process of rebuilding. Construction began in 2065, and the vault was unveiled in 2076 during the celebrations of America's 300th anniversary, presented as a symbol of national hope at a moment when hope was running thin. The vault opened on Reclamation Day, the 23rd of October 2102, 25 years after the Great War. The residents emerged into Appalachia to find a region that had not been idle in their absence. The scorched plague, the super mutants, the collapse of various factions that had tried to operate on the surface, all of it had shaped the wasteland. The 76 dwellers were supposed to reclaim. Vault 79, hidden in the Savage Divide behind a cave accessible only through a complex entry mechanism, served a purpose that had nothing to do with social experimentation. This was the vault the Treasury Department built to protect the United States' gold reserves. When the federal government moved the bullion from Fort Knox into Appalachia, Vault Tech provided the facility, and the Secret Service provided the guards. Vault 79 was never a shelter for civilians. It was a bank vault given the external appearance of a shelter, designed to ensure that whatever came after the Great War would still have access to physical gold. The implications of this, explored through the Wastelanders expansion, involve every faction that knows about the gold wanting to control it, and the question of whether pre-war monetary concepts have any meaning in a world rebuilt from scratch. Vault 94 was one of the more earnest in its design, at least in the goals it set for itself. It was populated by members of a pacifist religious community, people with a genuine ethical commitment to nonviolence, who were given the mandate to develop a garden and natural environment within the vault and eventually to help restore a region of the surface using their cultivation expertise. The experiment was not designed to break the community. It was designed to see whether genuine idealists could survive and thrive in the post-war world. The experiment failed, but not entirely because of external factors. The mechanisms of the vault itself, the various environmental systems that were supposed to support the garden, malfunctioned in ways that introduced gases into the inhabited sections. The vault became a series of challenges that the pacifist community was not equipped to survive. By the time players reach Vault 94 in Fallout 76, the original residents are long gone, the vault having become a challenging area with environmental hazards as a primary obstacle. Vault 96 was designed for genetic research involving direct experimentation on the resident population in relation to the mutated fauna of the post-war world. The idea was that a sealed community with controlled exposure to select samples of post-war creatures might develop novel adaptations or provide data on the interaction between pre-war human biology and the dramatically altered ecosystem above. The specifics of what this produced are less well documented than some other vaults, but the Appalachian wildlife has always carried a particular strangeness that Vault 96's research may have contributed to understanding. Number. Section 8. The Psychology of the Overseer. Every vault had an overseer. That position, in the official paperwork, is administrative. The overseer manages vault resources, resolves disputes, maintains order, and serves as the primary point of contact between the population and the vault's systems. In practice, the overseer position was something closer to the position of an absolute sovereign in a sealed kingdom, with the vault systems providing both the tools of governance and the means of enforcement. What Vault Tech understood, when they designed the overseer position, is that a single person with complete authority over a closed community in a stressful situation is going to make choices that no ethical review board would ever approve. The genius of the system from a data collection standpoint is that the overseer's decisions become data. Every act of self-preservation, every accommodation of the experiment's parameters, every moment of conscience or its absence is something the architects of the Vault program could observe and measure. The overseer of Vault 101, the vault at the center of Fallout 3's story, knew from the beginning that the door was never going to open. That was the experiment. Keep everyone inside indefinitely, and sustain the belief that the world outside was permanently uninhabitable. The overseer was given access to the outside world through a secret tunnel and radio communications. The residents had no such access. They lived entirely inside the information environment the overseer maintained, which included pre-recorded radio transmissions, describing a surface world even more terrible than the actual nuclear wasteland. The radio transmissions were produced before the Great War, when no one knew exactly what a post-nuclear surface would look like, and they describe a world of unrelenting horror. The overseer played these recordings to the residents as live transmissions, as evidence of ongoing conditions above. The residents, hearing these transmissions and trusting the overseer, stayed put. The vault's motto, "We are born in the vault, we live in the vault, and we die in the vault," was not a spontaneous cultural development. It was engineered by the overseer position, maintained from generation to generation by people whose authority rested on the community, never questioning it. The second overseer of Vault 101, remarkably, did try to open the vault and send out a scouting party. In 2241, this overseer sent Ann Palmer and a small team to the surface, where they explored the ruins of Springvale and found the settlement at Megaton. The decision was reversed when the team came back. Whether the information they brought made the overseer reconsider, or whether the political pressure within the vault made opening the door impossible to sustain, the records don't fully clarify. But the attempt happened. One overseer, somewhere in the chain, looked at the situation and decided that maybe the experiment should end. And then the experiment kept going anyway. The overseer of Vault 112, Stanislaus Braun, represents the terminus of what the overseer position becomes when the person in it has absolute power, no supervision, and a particular kind of psychological damage. He designed the simulation himself. He imprisoned himself in it voluntarily, giving up his aging physical body in favor of the virtual world where he would be permanently in control. What he became over 200 years of absolute authority over a captive population is documented in the things he made the lone wanderer do in Tranquility Lane, and in the system logs that describe, with the clinical language of experimental notation, what he did to the people in his care. The overseer of Vault 11 is a paradox. The position of overseer in that vault was a death sentence. You were elected to die. Every political organization in the vault existed specifically to make sure someone else got elected. The elaborate system of voting blocks and coalition politics that dominated Vault 11's history was entirely oriented around the mechanics of avoiding this specific fate. And yet people did get elected, and they did go to the sacrificial chamber. And the vault ran for decades. The overseer who had a coffee mug in the chamber is the most humanly complicated image in all of Vault 11's history. Someone who accepted their fate so completely that they brought their morning coffee to their own death. That kind of peace with the unacceptable is either wisdom or damage, or something that doesn't fit neatly into either category. The overseers of Vault 75, who managed the program of harvesting children and eliminating those deemed unfit, wrote their records in the language of science. The euphemisms in those terminal logs are meticulous. The clinical distance between the language and what it describes is total. An overseer who could produce that kind of documentation had learned to live inside a framework of abstraction that permitted them to manage what was happening without ever fully naming it. The overseer of Vault 95 embedded their own agent among the residents for years, watching the community's recovery, waiting for the moment to introduce the drugs, maintaining a persona among people who trusted them. That overseer had to be in the room when people celebrated their sobriety, when families were strengthened by the absence of addiction, when the community became genuinely better. And then they handed over the key to the hidden room. The psychology required to do that, to genuinely participate in a community's healing for long enough to be trusted, and then to dismantle it deliberately, is something the vault system produced as a matter of course. Number, Section 9. The Strange Vaults and the Stranger Details. Vault 21 in New Vegas has a detail that doesn't show up in most discussions of the facility. After Mr. House won almost everything in the vault through gambling, he had the vault sealed with concrete. Buried, Sarah, one of the last residents, managed to keep a small section accessible by converting it into the hotel and casino that operates above it in the game's present. The buried vault beneath the Mojave is full of the artifacts of a community that tried to resolve everything through chance and ended up getting beaten by someone who was simply very good at games. What's remarkable about Sarah's decision is the pragmatism of it. She could not reopen the vault. She could not undo what House did. So she built on top of it. The hotel above the buried community is its own kind of monument to adaptation. A surface structure constructed out of the necessity of dealing with an underground structure that was no longer accessible. Vault 22's botanical records, the research that was carried out before the spore catastrophe, represented genuine scientific advancement. Data recovered by a researcher named Keeley proved valuable to various factions in the Mojave trying to understand how to cultivate food in the post-war landscape. The vault destroyed its own community, but its research escaped in someone's hands, and the plants that overgrew the facility might, in a very specific and strange way, represent the most successful outcome any vault achieved. Actual useful data, extracted at a terrible cost, that improved life somewhere in the wasteland. Vault 34's boomers, the explosion enthusiasts of Nellis, carry the specific cultural legacy of their vault's weapons surplus in a way that has calcified over generations. For the original residents of Vault 34, the weapons were a destabilizing factor, a problem they inherited from a design they never chose. For the boomers at Nellis, those weapons are identity. The tools of their vault's downfall became the foundation of their community's culture. They surround themselves with artillery, maintain a vast arsenal, and view the outside world with the combination of disdain and suspicion that comes from generations of isolation and the specific lesson that outsiders bring danger. Vault 43, with its panther, is one of those vaults where the sheer specificity of the experimental condition is more disturbing than the outcome. The panther was not an accident. Someone at Vault-Tec authorized it. Someone decided that a large predatory animal in a sealed human community was a productive experimental variable. The panther had to be transported. It had to be fed during the vault's operation. Presumably, the residents were aware of its presence. The question of how a community manages the presence of a predator it cannot escape from is at least a coherent experimental question, even if the ethics of asking it that way are indefensible. Vault 51's ZAX-1. 3C. The AI that ran its vault by evaluating and eliminating leadership candidates is a fascinating piece of design because it reveals something about what the Vault program thought AI could do. The assumption embedded in Vault 51 is that an artificial intelligence could assess human leadership quality more accurately than humans themselves, and that the process of selection should therefore be handed over to a machine. ZAX-1. 3C created scenarios, gathered data, made determinations. It had no particular interest in the well-being of the people it was evaluating. It was a selection mechanism, and selection mechanisms don't worry about what the selection process feels like. Vault 63's connection to Brotherhood of Steel technology hints at the way certain Vault technologies escaped into the wider world through the organizations that found them. The Brotherhood's specific relationship to pre-war technology, their almost religious reverence for it, makes the discovery of an intact vault with experimental hardware a significant event in their institutional history. Vault-Tec's research did not stay in the vaults. It leaked out through survivors, through recovered terminals, through factions that found uses for what the experiments had produced. Vault 75's genetic research, the refinement program that selected children for organ harvest, is the most extreme application of the eugenics principles that the Vault program occasionally flirted with. The premise that certain genetic characteristics were worth preserving while others could be discarded represents a line of thinking that pre-war America had not fully abandoned, even as its public rhetoric endorsed equality and individual rights. Vault-Tec took those privately held beliefs about human quality and hierarchy and built infrastructure for them. Vault 79's gold reserves represent a different kind of ambition than the social experiments. The Treasury Department was not thinking about human behavior or survival psychology when it arranged to move bullion into Appalachia. It was thinking about continuity of economic infrastructure, the preservation of a system of value that could anchor whatever came after the war. In a world where civilization has to rebuild from scratch, whoever controls the gold controls the terms on which trade and exchange happen. Vault 79 was an attempt to ensure that certain pre-war power structures would persist into the post-war world, that whoever emerged from the ashes would still be operating within an economy somebody else had defined. The irony is that gold in the post-war Commonwealth is not meaningless, but it is one layer of exchange removed from practical survival. Bottle caps, filtered through the water purification systems that Vault-Tec also developed, became the dominant currency in many regions simply because water was worth more than gold in a world where water wasn't guaranteed. The economic assumptions of Vault 79 met the practical realities of the wasteland and had to be renegotiated. Number Section 10. The vaults we know only by number. The Vault network included 122 facilities. The mainline games, the spin-offs, the webcomics, and the supplementary lore materials have fleshed out the stories of roughly 40 to 50 of those vaults in meaningful detail. The remaining 70 plus exist as numbers and records, as references and documents, as gaps that the imagination fills. What kinds of experiments might those unrecorded vaults have run? The Vault program's creativity, based on the experiments we know about, was considerable. They tested paranoia. They tested sacrifice. They tested the effects of extreme gender imbalance. They tested what happens when you give everyone too many weapons. They tested virtual reality as a long-term substitute for life. They tested whether you could keep people underground forever just by telling them the surface was uninhabitable. They tested what isolation does to a single person. They tested what isolation does to a population. They tested addiction. They tested drugs. They tested music as a vector for mind control. They tested what happens when you fill a vault with weapons and then appoint an overseer with 3 months to live. The numbered vaults we don't have stories for might have run anything from the horrifying to the mundane to the absurdly specific. A vault where all disputes were resolved by arm wrestling. A vault where no artificial lighting was permitted. A vault where everyone had to wear the same size clothing regardless of actual body size. A vault where every resident was given a different story about why they were there. The gaps in the record are not just absences. They're invitations. The vault number is there. The facility was built. People went inside. And then, somewhere in the years between the Great War and the game's present, something happened. And whatever the something was, it's not in any surviving document we know of. Some of those vaults probably didn't collapse at all. Some of them might have held communities that functioned well enough, that found equilibrium, that opened on schedule and sent people out into the wasteland without any particular story worth telling. Not every vault needs to be a catastrophe. But given what we know about Vault-Tech's design philosophy, the ones that ran without incident were probably the boring ones. The interesting experiments, the ones worth running if your goal is data about extreme human conditions, tend to produce exactly the kinds of outcomes we've been discussing. Communities torn apart by their experimental parameters, populations transformed by biological agents, survivors carrying the specific damage of whatever variable their vault contained. Vault 55 is referenced in some sources as having lost its supply of certain essential entertainment media, the comedia in its operation, resulting in a population that had to generate its own culture from scratch. Vault 56 reportedly had a single entertainment tape that played on repeat until the vault opened. The psychological effects of extended cultural monotony versus the open-ended challenge of creating entertainment without resources are an interesting set of comparisons, and if either vault was deliberately set up that way, it represents a gentler application of the Vault program's philosophy of imposed constraint. Vault 92's selection of musicians as experimental subjects deserves more consideration than it usually receives. The Vault's researchers understood that musicians would be less likely than other populations to show obvious signs of stress-related illness because creative communities have established vocabularies for expressing and processing emotional pain. They chose musicians specifically because the cover of artistic sensitivity would mask the behavioral changes that the white noise was supposed to produce. In a community of accountants or engineers, behavioral changes might be more quickly attributed to something environmental. In a community of musicians, erratic behavior and heightened emotional responses are part of the expected baseline. The selection of subject populations for Vault experiments shows considerable sophistication across multiple facilities. Vault 95 chose addicts because addiction represents a specific vulnerability that the experiment could target with precision. Vault 75 chose children because children are malleable, not yet fully formed as human beings, making genetic intervention during development potentially more effective. Vault 92 chose musicians for camouflage. The research design behind many of these vaults was not crude. It was careful, specific, thought through, which makes the ethical dimension more rather than less troubling. These were not careless acts of cruelty. They were planned. The harm was anticipated and incorporated into the experimental design. Number. Section 11. What the Vaults Built. When we look at the post-war landscape across all the Fallout games, A significant portion of the major factions, settlements, and social structures traces back directly to vault populations. The NCR, the New California Republic that represents the closest thing the Fallout world has to a functional democratic state at the time of New Vegas, grew from the diverse population of Vault 15. The specific tensions and disagreements that Vault-Tec designed into Vault 15 didn't destroy the community, they dispersed it, and the dispersal produced multiple distinct cultural groups that each built something. The NCR is the largest and arguably most successful of those built things. It also carries within it the specific genetic conflicts of its origin, the tendency toward political fragmentation, the competing ideological traditions of the groups that separated. The boomers of Nellis Air Force Base, as we've discussed, came from Vault 34's weapons-saturated population. Their identity is inseparable from the Vault's design flaw, or rather, its design feature. The oversupply of weapons that destabilized their community became the value system of their descendants. The Children of the Cathedral, in some canonical framings, trace to Vault 29's AI-raised population. Their reverence for ZAX's environmental philosophy translated and distorted across generations into something that looked more like religion than science, represents the natural evolution of a belief system instilled by a machine in children who never knew any other authority. The ghoul population of the Mojave can be traced in part to Vault 12's failed door. Those irradiated residents, transformed by the radiation that poured through the improperly sealed entrance, eventually formed what became Necropolis. Their existence as ghouls, their transformation from the people they were before the bombs fell, was the direct result of an engineering decision made before the war by people who knew the door wouldn't close. The super mutants of the Capital Wasteland came from Vault 87, not from the bombs, not from some post-war accident, but from a deliberate decision to expose human beings to a virus that was always going to transform them. The Capital Wasteland-specific super mutant variant, more aggressive and less cognitively functional than the Mariposa variants of California, is a product of the specific FEV strain used in Vault 87's experiment. Vault City, as mentioned, grew from the functional GEC technology provided to Vault 8. The relative stability and technological sophistication of that settlement, its ability to maintain pre-war medical standards and technological infrastructure, came from the Vault's unusual status as a facility that actually worked as publicly described. The powder gangers of New Vegas, who escaped from a prison work detail and became one of the Mojave's more chaotic early factions, include survivors from Vault 19. The paranoia that characterized Vault 19's experimental environment didn't end when the vault opened. It traveled with the people who left it, shaped how they related to outsiders, contributed to the difficulty of integrating them into larger social structures. New Vegas itself, the functioning casino city at the center of Fallout New Vegas, owes its specific character in part to the cultural output of Vault 21. The gambling economy that Mr. House built on the Strip is, in a very direct way, the expansion of Vault 21's experiment to an entire city. House didn't invent gambling as a social organization principle in this region. He found a population that had already been organized around it and built an empire on top of what they'd already built. What the Vault program produced, over 200 years, was not simply the Enclave's intended human resource. It produced a world. The factions, the mutations, the cultural traditions, the architectural ruins, the surviving technologies, all of it emerged from the interaction between the Vault experiments and whatever waited outside when the doors finally opened. Vault-Tec designed a series of boxes and put people in them. The people in the boxes, and their children, and their children's children, built the wasteland. Number section 12. The small details that stay with you. It's the details, in the end, that make the Vault stories feel real rather than hypothetical. The coffee mug outside the sacrifice chamber in Vault 11. The note from the parent in Vault 87 who didn't know their child was a test subject. The single Vault 77 jumpsuit in Paradise Falls that makes battle-hardened slavers beg their colleagues to get rid of it before its owner comes back. The musical instruments in Vault 92. Fallout 3's design team scattered them throughout the facility, in rooms where their owners died, in corridors they were dragged through. A violin in a pool of dried blood, a piano in a room with broken doors. Someone played these things. Someone practiced scales in that room, learned compositions, got better at something, and then was driven to violence by sounds they could hear only while sleeping. The armory sign in Vault 34, sitting above shelves of weapons that were always going to cause exactly the outcome they caused. The sign doesn't know what it's presiding over. Signs never do. Vault-Tec signs are always cheerful, always pointing toward the future with that upturned thumb, that round-faced smile. The signage and the content they point to occupy two completely different moral universes. The Tranquility Loungers in Vault 112, egg-shaped and smooth, designed to look comfortable and futuristic. Inside each one, a person who has no idea what year it is, no idea their body is in a vault that has been sitting underground while the world above ended and reformed. Inside each one, a consciousness experiencing whatever Braun decided they should experience today. Old Lady Dithers, who knew the simulation was artificial and could tell no one. She appears as a character in the Tranquility Lane quest, going about the simulated routine of her simulated life, aware that none of it is real, unable to change any of it. That specific horror knowing and being powerless is the purest distillation of the entire Vault experience. The mole rats in Vault 81, carrying a 200-year-old pathogen through the sealed section of a facility whose experiment was sabotaged out of conscience. The saboteur chose the welfare of the population over the parameters of the experiment. The mole rats didn't get that memo. They just kept doing what they were doing, carrying the disease through corridors where no human had walked in generations, waiting for someone to open the door. The terminals in Vault 75, where the researchers documented the assessment of children and the clinical determination of their fitness. The language used in those entries, the passive constructions and the scientific framing, is a specific kind of moral failure. It's what happens when people decide to narrate what they're doing in terms of the experiment rather than in terms of the children. Vault 92's last log entries, where residents who don't understand why they're feeling this way try to describe the violence they experience themselves committing. People who love their community, who built their lives on musical collaboration and creative partnership, writing about what it felt like to hurt someone and not know why. The self-awareness of those entries makes them unbearable in a specific way. These weren't people who chose violence. Violence was chosen for them and delivered through the vents while they slept. Vault 15's cultural diversity, the specific mix of people Vault-Tec selected to create productive friction, eventually producing the NCR and the Great Khans and the Jackals and the Vipers. The conflict that was designed into the population didn't stay in the vault. It became the political landscape of an entire region. 4 factions from one vault, 4 diverging ideas about how to live, spreading through the Mojave and the broader California wasteland, shaping everything they touched. And somewhere in the wasteland, right now in the game's timeline, the puppet man who came out of Vault 77 is out there. He has his puppets. He left the vault when the coup among his fictional creations became unbearable, when the characters he'd invented had become realer to him than the real world ever was, and then he walked out into a wasteland that was genuinely more dangerous than anything he'd imagined. He survived it. The slavers at Paradise Falls are afraid of him. He became something the nuclear wasteland found threatening, which is an extraordinary achievement for a person whose only companions for years were handmade figures in a box. What the Vault program didn't account for, or perhaps what it was always actually measuring without anyone's full awareness, was the capacity of human beings to absorb tremendous damage and produce something from it anyway. The survivors of Vault 15 built civilizations. The survivors of Vault 34 built a fortress and a culture. The survivor of Vault 77 built an identity out of the wreckage of his isolation, however fractured that identity might be. Even Vault 12's ghouls, their bodies permanently transformed, built necropolis. Even the super mutants of Vault 87, most of whom lost everything that made them who they were before the FEV, produced at least 2 individuals, Fox and Uncle Leo, who retained enough of themselves to be remarkable. The vaults were designed to study what happens when you take everything away from people. The answer, over and over and in different forms, is that they find something to build. Number. Section 13. The Vaults of the TV Timeline. The Amazon television adaptation of Fallout introduced a set of interconnected vaults centered around the Santa Monica Pier in Los Angeles. Vaults 31, 32, and 33. Because the show operates on its own timeline and diverges from game canon in several significant ways, a thorough treatment of these vaults belongs in a separate discussion of the show's lore. What can be said briefly? is that the connected vault concept, where multiple facilities are designed to interact with each other and with each other's populations, represents an evolution of the vault program's complexity beyond the individual experiment paradigm. The idea that vaults might be designed to influence each other, that the experiment might span multiple facilities and the relationships between them, follows logically from the sophistication of the vault program's other designs. If you can engineer paranoia with partitions and slightly different broadcast schedules, you can certainly engineer inter-vault dynamics with selective contact and population transfers. The show's revelations about Vault-Tech's ultimate ambitions, specifically the suggestion that Vault-Tech may have had a more direct role in the Great War than previously implied in game canon, represents a divergence significant enough that game canon lore discussions generally treat it as a separate thread. In the game canon, Vault-Tech is evil but reactive. They designed experiments to run in the event of nuclear war, and they planned to use the results, but the war itself was not their doing. In the show's canon, the implication is considerably darker, and Vault-Tech's culpability extends further back than the bombs falling. Both versions of Vault-Tech are moral catastrophes. They differ in scale. Number, Section 14. What the experiments were really for. The stated purpose of the Vault experiments, across all the primary lore materials, was to prepare humanity for space colonization. In a world where the resource wars had made Earth's surface increasingly inhospitable even before the Great War, Vault-Tech and its government partners had an eye on the stars as humanity's long-term survival option. The vaults were, in this framing, test chambers for the conditions of long-duration space travel, extended confinement, artificial environments, closed-loop life support systems, small populations with no external contact and no exit. The experiments run inside the vaults, from this perspective, make a certain kind of sense. You want to know how people manage hierarchy and isolation, how they handle resource constraints, how they respond to deliberate stressors, how they maintain social cohesion without natural population replacement. All of those things matter if you're planning to send people on multi-generational voyages to other star systems. The fact that the experimental methods used were unethical by any reasonable standard is almost beside the point if you start from the premise that the experimenters genuinely believed the future of the species depended on the data. That doesn't excuse it, it contextualizes it. Vault-Tech, and the government that funded and guided it, had decided that the survival of humanity at a species level was worth the sacrifice of the humanity of the people inside the vaults. The Enclave, which was the shadow government faction behind much of Vault-Tech's research agenda, had specific plans for the Vault populations. They were, in the Enclave's vision, the genetic material from which a new, pure humanity would be built after the Great War, with the Enclave itself at the apex. The experiments were quality control. The vaults were selection mechanisms. The survivors who proved adaptive and capable would form the foundation of whatever came next. The ones who didn't were data. That the Enclave itself largely collapsed in the events of Fallout 2 and Fallout 3 means that most of the Vault data was never properly analyzed by anyone with the institutional capacity to use it. The Vaults ran their experiments. The people inside lived and died and were transformed. The records accumulated in terminals that eventually stopped receiving external signals, and the apparatus of collection and analysis that the experiments were designed to feed simply ceased to exist. The vaults kept running anyway. Because the systems were designed for longevity and the overseers were programmed to maintain their parameters regardless of whether anyone was still watching. The data no one would ever fully analyze accumulated in the silence of sealed rooms, stored on terminals that continued to function long after the organization that needed them was gone. It's one of the more melancholy aspects of the Vault program. The experiments may have produced genuinely useful information about human endurance and social dynamics and biological adaptation. If they had been conducted ethically, with consent and proper care for subjects, some of that information might have been genuinely valuable. But the methodology corrupted everything it touched. The data is real, and the insights might be real, and none of it can be separated from the harm that produced it. Number Section 15, the final detail. There is one vault in the network that deserves a closing mention not because it is the most dramatic or the most terrible, but because it is the most human. Vault 81 survived, not perfectly. Not without its own shadows, the experimental laboratory sealed in its lower levels. the researcher's crisis of conscience, the disease-carrying mole rats waiting in the dark. But the community of Vault 81, by the time players arrive in Fallout 4, is alive. People are having conversations in the corridors. Children are running in the common areas. The food systems are functioning. The medical bay is operational. The overseer is making difficult decisions, but they are decisions a person makes, not a mechanism running a program. It survived because one person decided not to do something they were told to do. The researcher who was supposed to administer the experimental compounds to an unknowing population looked at the people around him, people who had trusted the vault with their lives and couldn't do it. He sabotaged the systems. He wrote his decision into the record. And then the community lived. That's the counterpoint to everything else in the Vault program. Vault 81 is what a vault is when the person in the lab has a conscience. Not a utopia, not a paradise. Just a community of people who got to live their lives without being experimented on and who built something real out of that gift. The Vault program produced horrors through design. It produced Vault 81 through defiance. And maybe that's the point. Not the point Vault Tech was trying to make, but the point the stories make when you look at all of them together. The thing that the experiments couldn't account for and couldn't eliminate and couldn't predict with any of their careful psychological design and social engineering was the individual decision to say no. Vault 11's final 5 survivors said no. Vault 81's researcher said no. The Vault 13 overseer who sent out the scouting party, however briefly, was trying to say yes to the world outside. The vaults were built to control everything. They couldn't control the moment when one person looked at the parameters they were given and decided that the parameters were wrong. That moment kept happening. In the middle of all the darkness and the careful experimental design and the 200-year machines running in the dark, people kept finding a way to be human about it. However briefly, however incompletely, however impermanently, it is, in the end, the thing the wasteland is built on. Number. Section 16. Deeper into the Mojave Vaults. The Mojave Desert is a particular kind of harsh. It has always been a particular kind of harsh, long before the bombs fell, long before the resource wars began bleeding the color out of the world's political map. The heat and the distance and the way the landscape extends in all directions without apology, flat and hostile and indifferent to whoever happens to be crossing it, created a very specific kind of survival culture in the pre-war American Southwest. When Vault Tech placed 6 vaults in the Mojave region, Vault 3, Vault 11, Vault 19, Vault 21, Vault 22, and Vault 34. They were planting their experimental apparatus in a place where the ground itself was already making demands of anyone who lived on it. The 6 Mojave vaults form a kind of case study in the variety of approaches Vault Tech brought to its experimental program. 3 of them were specifically designed around social engineering of the most deliberate kind. One became famous for an agricultural experiment that produced a biological catastrophe. One was, in the official record at least, a relatively functional facility that met a terrible end, not through internal design but through the randomness of the wasteland. And one, Vault 3, represents the most painful outcome of all. A vault that worked, that held together, that produced a community capable of survival, and then walked out the door into something that killed it immediately. The geographic placement of these vaults is also worth thinking about. They were built close enough to each other that, in a well-organized wasteland, communication between their surviving populations might have been possible. The Mojave had the potential to become a network of vault communities informally trading and interacting. Instead, what emerged was the wildly varied faction landscape of New Vegas. The NCR pushing in from the west, Caesar's Legion crossing from the east, Mr. House operating from his tower, various independent communities from former vault populations maintaining their own arrangements. Every major Mojave faction has vault DNA somewhere in its ancestry. The Great Khans, who had descended partly from Vault 15's diverse population, became the most powerful gang in the region before the NCR's expansion campaigns reduced them to a remnant. The NCR itself, as we've noted, traces its foundational institutions to those same Vault 15 origins. The whole elaborate political ecology of the Mojave, the 3-way standoff at Hoover Dam that Fallout New Vegas documents in such detail, can be traced back to a series of experimental decisions made in the years before the bombs fell by people who were trying to measure human behavior rather than guide it toward any particular outcome. The Hoover Dam itself, the focus of New Vegas's central conflict, is a piece of pre-war infrastructure that survived the Great War and became the most valuable resource in the entire region, capable of producing enough electricity to power a significant portion of the wasteland. The battle over who controls the dam, and therefore who controls the power and the water it manages, is the central question of the game's political landscape. And if you trace every major faction involved in that conflict back to its origins, a significant portion of them connect, through chains of influence and descent and cultural inheritance, to the Mojave Vault program. Vault 19 in particular is worth an extended look because its experiment in induced paranoia has broader implications for how we think about trust and community in the Fallout world. The Vault didn't need to use force to fracture its population. It just needed to create conditions in which suspicion was the rational response. Two sections, separated by a wall, aware of each other's presence but not each other's reality. Slightly different messages broadcast to each section. Maintenance schedules that looked, from the inside, like one section was being favored over the other. Paranoia is not irrational in an environment where the information you receive is controlled by someone who has their own agenda. The residents of Vault 19 were not crazy for becoming suspicious of each other. They were responding to real, if manufactured, asymmetries in their environment. The experiment's genius, from a purely clinical standpoint, was in creating conditions where paranoia was the correct adaptive response to the actual information available, which made the paranoia self-sustaining and almost impossible to dismantle from the inside. Once you understand that someone is giving different messages to different groups, once you realize that the information environment you're operating in is not neutral, the paranoia doesn't go away. It deepens, because now you know that you can't trust the information you're receiving, which means you can't trust that your assessment of which information to distrust is itself accurate. It's a cognitive trap. The experiment put Vault 19's residents inside a trap and observed how long it took them to stop functioning as a community. The answer was long enough to produce the powder gangers, who brought their distrust of authority and their hair-trigger defensiveness out into the wasteland with them and made it everyone else's problem. Number section. 17. The Capital Wasteland's Vault Ecology. The area around Washington, D.C. that became the Capital Wasteland had, at the time of Fallout 3, one of the densest concentrations of vault facilities of any region in the former United States. Vaults 87, 92, 101, 106, 108, and 112 were all located within reasonable distance of each other, scattered through the ruins of what had been the political and cultural heart of American democracy. The proximity of these vaults to each other, and to the ruins of the institutions that had commissioned the Vault program in the first place, gives the Capital Wasteland a particular texture. The Brotherhood of Steel is operating out of what had been the Pentagon. The Enclave, the shadow government faction behind much of Vault-Tech's agenda, has its major presence in this region, in the form of Raven Rock and later the Purifier. The ruins of Washington themselves, the monuments and the museums and the government buildings, sit at the center of it all. The Vault program and the government that created it are both visible in the Capital Wasteland in a way that they aren't quite as visible anywhere else. The Brotherhood's obsessive collection of pre-war technology is directly connected to the kind of research that vaults like 87 and 112 were conducting. The Enclave's plans for purifying the water supply, which turn out to involve a genocidal component, echo the population management ethos that ran through the Vault program from the beginning. Vault 87's super mutants are the most visible legacy of the Capital Wasteland Vault experiments in the game's physical landscape. They're everywhere. They're organized enough to maintain a stronghold at Vault 87, using the facility's research infrastructure to perpetuate their own population through force, capturing humans from across the wasteland, and subjecting them to the same FEV exposure that created them. It's a self-sustaining horror that grows from the Vault outward into the wasteland, transforming the region's human ecology in ways that the original experiment's designers may or may not have anticipated. Vault 92's musical community, by contrast, left almost nothing. The Vault is intact enough to explore, the instruments are still there, but the community itself is gone. What the white noise experiment destroyed was not just the people, it was the specific thing they had built. The collaborative, creative culture of Vault 92, built around shared musical practice and creative partnership, was destroyed by sounds delivered during sleep. The instruments in the abandoned rooms are relics of something that might have been remarkable under different circumstances. There is a particular cruelty in the choice of population for Vault 92. Musicians are not typically selected for their capacity for violence or their resilience to stress in the way that, say, soldiers or survivalists might be. They're selected for sensitivity, for the ability to feel things deeply and translate those feelings into art. The white noise experiment didn't just provoke violence in a random population. It provoked violence in a population specifically selected for emotional depth and connectivity. The experiment broke people who, more than most, had the language and the capacity to understand what was happening to them if only someone had told them the truth. Vault 101's relationship to the Capital Wasteland is different from all the other vaults because it's the vault that didn't really open. While the other Capital Wasteland vaults had their catastrophes and their openings and produced their various populations and consequences, Vault 101 was still running its experiment when the lone wanderer left. The community was still inside. The overseer was still maintaining the fiction that the surface was uninhabitable. The residents were still living as though nothing outside the vault could possibly matter to them. The game's epilogue, delivered through radio broadcasts depending on player choices, tells us what happens after. The vault community is fractured by the lone wanderer's departure, divided between those who want to follow them out and those who insist the vault is still the only safe place. The conflict between these factions mirrors, in a smaller and more specific register, the same kind of factional conflict that destroyed Vault 11 and destabilized Vault 34. The pressure of the experiment breaking down, of the information that sustained the social order being revealed as fiction, creates exactly the kind of community fracturing crisis that Vault-Tech's experiment design seemed almost designed to produce. Which raises the question of whether Vault 101's experiment was really about the surface world or about the overseer position. The official documentation suggests the vault was designed to test the role of the overseer. How effectively could a single authority figure maintain an information environment? And for how long could a population be kept believing something that wasn't true? The overseer's authority in Vault 101 depended entirely on the residents continuing to believe the lies they were told. The moment the lies became questionable, the authority structure of the vault became questionable, and the community began to come apart. Vault 106, with its 200-year drug supply still flowing through the ventilation, represents a different kind of persistence. The experiment in Vault 106 never ended because the mechanism of the experiment was physical infrastructure, a ventilation system pumping compounds into the air, and no one ever turned it off. The people who were originally drugged are dead. The people in Vault 106 when the lone wanderer arrives are people who wandered in from the wasteland and were immediately subjected to the same chemical environment that drove the original residents to violence. The experiment consumes new subjects automatically. It's one of the more disturbing aspects of the Vault program's legacy. Some vaults continued operating in some sense long after their original populations were gone. The systems kept running. The parameters kept being applied. Whatever the experiment was testing, the testing continued in the absence of any particular intentionality on anyone's part. The machines didn't know the experiment was over. They just kept doing what they were built to do. Number, Section 18. The Commonwealth's Vault History and Aftermath. Boston and the surrounding Massachusetts region became the Commonwealth after the Great War, and the vaults built in this area were some of the most varied in the network. They included Vault 75 beneath a middle school, Vault 81 with its sabotaged medical experiment, Vault 88 as a prototype testing facility, Vault 95 for recovering addicts, Vault 111 as the game's starting point, and Vault 114 in the subway system. The Commonwealth itself is distinguished from other Fallout regions by the presence of the Institute, a secretive organization descended from MIT researchers who survived the Great War and have spent 200 years pursuing scientific agendas that, in many respects, echo the original Vault program. The Institute creates synthetic humans, conducts biological experiments, and operates with a level of secrecy and moral flexibility that would have felt very familiar to Vault-Tech's research division. The relationship between the Institute and Vault 111 is direct and documented. The Institute's representatives, working with a pre-war mercenary named Kellogg, entered the vault approximately 10 years after sealing to retrieve a specific infant. The vault's life support systems were still running. The cryopreserved residents were still in their pods. The Institute simply walked in, used the override systems to wake the sole survivor's spouse, committed murder, took the child, and refroze the remaining residents. The child, Sean, grew up to become the director of the institute. The man who, as an infant, was stolen from a sealed vault became the head of the organization that most closely resembles Vault-Tech's research division in the post-war period. There is a generational continuity of moral failure implied in that biography that the game doesn't fully articulate, but that the lore makes visible if you look at it from the right angle. The Institute's experiments with synths, their creation of artificial humans advanced enough to pass as biological people, can be read as an evolution of the Vault program's interest in human adaptation. The Vault experiments tested what biological humans could endure and how they would adapt. The Institute's synth research tests what it means to be human in the first place, whether a being that experiences the world the same way a human does and reports those experiences the same way deserves to be classified as human or as property. The ethical questions the Institute raises are the same questions the Vault program raised, translated into a new technological register. Vault 75 is particularly significant in the Commonwealth context because the Gunners who now occupy it represent a post-Vault trajectory, a mercenary organization, brutal and profit-driven, using the infrastructure of a facility that existed to destroy children in the name of genetic science. The Gunners didn't build Vault 75. They inherited it. They found a place designed for systematic violence and decided it was a useful workspace. That inheritance is a pattern across the Fallout world. Vaults that fail as communities become claimed by whoever finds them. The Brotherhood of Steel, the various raider factions, the Gunners, independent traders, ghouls, super mutants, all of them eventually find vaults and use what's left. The experimental infrastructure, the sealed rooms, the power systems still drawing from geothermal sources hundreds of years after construction, the water recyclers and the food processors, all of it eventually gets repurposed. Vault 111, where Fallout 4 begins, is interesting in terms of its post-experiment status. The experiment ran for several months, the Vault staff dying off, and then was interrupted by the Institute's incursion, and then effectively ended when the sole survivor was awoken 2 centuries later. The Vault is intact but depopulated. Its cryopods are open, their former occupants dead, their life support systems having failed at some point during the long wait. Only the sole survivor's pod maintained functionality long enough. The Commonwealth settlement network that the player helps build in Fallout 4 is, in some ways, the most concrete version of the Vault program's stated purpose. Communities established in the post-war landscape, building infrastructure, developing governance, figuring out how to sustain themselves. The difference is that these settlements are built by choice, from scratch, on the surface, in the open air. No overseer locked the door. No experiment determined the parameters. People chose to be there and chose to build what they built. The contrast between the Vault communities, closed and experimental and driven by parameters no one chose, and the surface settlements of the Commonwealth, chaotic and dangerous and entirely self-determined, is one of the ways Fallout 4 structures its central thematic question. What makes a person, and what does it mean to be free? Number. Section 19. The Overseer's Tools. How Vaults were controlled. Understanding the Vault program requires understanding the mechanisms of control that Vault-Tech built into every facility. The Overseer position was not just administrative in the way a manager is administrative. It was structural, backed by physical systems that gave the Overseer tools unavailable to anyone else in the facility. Every Vault had a terminal network that the Overseer could access with elevated permissions. Maintenance systems, life support controls, security systems, communications equipment, Vault door mechanisms, all of it sat behind access levels that only the Overseer and a small number of designated staff could reach. The Overseer didn't need to use force, in most cases, because the alternative to cooperation was losing access to systems that kept everyone alive. The water recycler, the air filtration system, the food processor, the medical systems in a sealed environment with no outside supply chain. Control of these systems is absolute power. A resident who challenged the Overseer's authority was challenging someone who could, technically, turn off the water. In practice, most Overseers didn't do things quite that extreme, but the existence of that capability shaped every social interaction in the Vault. Everyone knew where the power ultimately resided. The security systems added another layer. Automated turrets, lockable blast doors within the Vault, security forces drawn from the resident population and equipped with better gear than civilians. Vault-Tec designed the physical layout of its facilities with the assumption that residents might need to be contained in specific sections, that conflict might require physical separation, that the overseer might need to move between areas of the vault while keeping certain residents where they were. The monitoring systems are perhaps the most pervasive tool in the overseer's kit. Every room in a standard vault has surveillance equipment. Terminals can be checked. Pip-Boys track the location and vital signs of residents. The overseer, in theory, can know at any given moment where every resident is, what their current health status is, and what they've been doing. That level of surveillance, in a sealed environment from which there is no exit, shapes behavior in the same way that Vault 19's experiment shaped behavior. Not through direct force, but through the constant awareness of being observed. People who know they are being watched modify their behavior. Not always in the way the watcher intends, but they modify it. Vault residents who understood the extent of the monitoring system developed strategies for navigating it. Rooms where the cameras had malfunctions, communication patterns that avoided the most obvious surveillance tools, social networks that operated through face-to-face contact in ways that left minimal digital trace. The underground spaces beneath the official vault levels, the maintenance areas and utility tunnels, and the sections sealed by overseers for various reasons became in many vaults the places where real life happened, where the conversations that couldn't be monitored were held, where the communities that existed outside the official social order gathered, where the pressure of the experiment's conditions could be briefly released. Vault 101's overseer had a secret tunnel. Vault 81 had its hidden laboratory. Vault 95 had its sealed room full of drugs. Every vault had its secrets, its spaces that the official layout didn't acknowledge, its infrastructure that operated outside the visible parameters of the experiment. These hidden spaces are the places where the gap between the vault's official purpose and its actual experience becomes visible. The Pip-Boy itself is worth a brief examination in this context. Vault-Tec issued these wrist-mounted personal computers to all vault residents, and they served a genuine function: tracking health, storing information, accessing the vault systems, serving as a communication device. But they also served as data collection tools, recording the wearer's location, vital signs, and activity patterns, and reporting that data to the vault's central systems. Every vault resident walked around carrying a device that reported their condition and position to the overseer in real time. The Pip-Boy's ubiquity in the post-war wasteland found in the hands of vault dwellers, picked up by non-vault survivors, valued for its capabilities means that the data collection infrastructure of the Vault program extended into the wasteland with the people who left. The device designed to monitor experimental subjects became a general-purpose survival tool, its surveillance functions either unknown to most users or simply accepted as the price of the capabilities it provided. Number. Section 20. The Enclave's role and the data that never arrived. The Enclave is, in the Fallout canon, the shadow government faction that operated alongside and within the official U.S. government in the years before the Great War. They planned for the war with a level of personal investment that most government officials didn't, because they believed themselves to be the people worth saving, the true inheritors of American civilization, the seed population from which a rebuilt nation would grow. The Vault program was, in the Enclave's conception, a selection process. The vaults would subject the American population to various pressures and measure their responses, and the data collected would allow the Enclave to identify which communities, which lineages, which behavioral patterns were worth incorporating into the post-war project. The experiments weren't just measurements. They were the mechanism by which the Enclave intended to sort humanity into categories: useful and not useful, resilient and not resilient, genetically sound and not. The evolutionary experimentation program in Vault 87, conducted with Enclave involvement, was not just about producing super mutants as such. It was about understanding the FEV, the forced evolutionary virus, in enough detail to potentially use it deliberately on target populations after the war. The Enclave's plans for the post-war world involved, depending on which faction documents you read, various methods of population purification that required an understanding of what FEV could do to human bodies. Raven Rock, the Enclave's primary base of operations in the Capital Wasteland, is located not far from several of the Capital Wasteland's major vault sites. This proximity was not coincidental. The Enclave positioned itself to receive data from the Vault experiments it had a stake in, to monitor the populations it was using as experimental subjects, and to be ready to act on the results when the time came. The time never quite came. The Enclave's plans in Fallout 2, centered on restoring a purified version of humanity to the former United States, were disrupted by the Chosen One. Their later plans in Fallout 3, involving Project Purity and the deliberate poisoning of the water supply to eliminate impure populations, were disrupted by the Lone Wanderer. The Enclave as a coherent organization does not survive into the later Fallout timeline in any functional sense. What survives are remnants. The Enclave remnants in Fallout New Vegas are veterans of the organization's defeat, scattered individuals who have spent years in the wasteland trying to figure out what to do with their training, their ideology, and their sense of having been part of something that mattered. The White Spring Bunker in Appalachia, seen in Fallout 76, represents another strand of the Enclave's survival, an AI-managed installation that attempted to maintain the organization's mission after its human leadership was gone. The data that the Vault experiments generated, the decades of observations and measurements and terminal logs and biological samples, sits largely uncollected and unanalyzed. The organization that was going to use it is mostly gone. The vaults that produced it are ruins or active crises, or, in rare cases like Vault 81, still functioning communities who would rather not think about the program they were part of. In the absence of the Enclave's analytic apparatus, the Vault data has become archaeology. Players exploring terminals read the records of experiments they are seeing only from the outside, looking at data points without access to the conclusions that the original experimenters would have drawn. The information is there, but the interpretive framework has dissolved. What we're left with, as players and as people thinking about the Vault program, is our own interpretation. What did the experiments show? Not in the cold clinical language of the Vault tech researchers, but in the human language of the experiences documented in those terminals. What did Vault 11 teach us? What did Vault 92 demonstrate? What do the Gary clones of Vault 108 tell us about identity and the limitations of a single template replicated beyond its useful range? The answers are not the ones Vault Tech was looking for. They're the ones you find when you read those terminals slowly and pay attention to the way the language changes as things get worse, the way the early records are formal and the late records are desperate, the way the official documentation and the personal logs say such completely different things about the same events. Number Section 21. Radiation, mutation, and the Vault's genetic legacy. One of the Vault program's more interesting, broader effects on the Fallout world is the way it concentrated and then distributed genetic material. The Vault served as sealed gene pools, isolated from the radiation and mutation that was altering the surface population. The residents of functioning vaults, who spent their lifetimes underground without exposure to the altered ecology of the post-war surface, maintained a pre-war human genetic profile in a way that surface survivors could not. When those vaults eventually opened, their populations represented a different kind of genetic pool from the people they encountered on the surface. Not better. Exactly. Though the Enclave would have framed it that way. Different. Pre-war baseline human genetics meeting the adaptive variations that radiation and the mutagens of the wasteland had introduced into the surface-dwelling population over 200 years. The Vault dwellers of the original Fallout game, the Chosen One of Fallout 2, the Lone Wanderer of Fallout 3, the Courier of New Vegas, the sole survivor of Fallout 4. All of them carry this distinction. They came from sealed gene pools. They are walking into a world that has been changing in their absence. The ghouls of the wasteland, transformed by radiation in ways that produced both physical alteration and, for the feral variety, cognitive deterioration, represent the most visually obvious example of the surface's genetic history over the past 2 centuries. Some ghouls are functionally human in everything but appearance, their radiation exposure having stabilized into a form of extended life rather than decay. Others have crossed into the feral state, their higher functions eroded by radiation damage in ways that make them effectively a different kind of creature. The supermutants, descended from the FEV experiments at Mariposa and Vault 87, represent a more deliberate kind of genetic transformation, one imposed by human agency rather than environmental exposure. The 2 major super mutant populations in the games, the Mariposa-derived West Coast mutants, and the Vault 87-derived Capital Wasteland mutants have different characteristics because they came from different FEV strains, a detail that the game's lore handles with considerable specificity. The Vault program, paradoxically, both preserved and transformed. It preserved the genetic baseline of pre-war humanity in its sealed communities while simultaneously, in the experimental vaults, conducting some of the most aggressive genetic transformation ever imposed on a human population. Vault 75's program of genetic refinement, however horrifying in its methods, was attempting to deliberately accelerate the kind of selective pressure that evolution applies over thousands of generations. The Vault's researchers believed they could identify and preserve superior genetic characteristics while eliminating inferior ones, producing an optimized population in a few generations rather than a few millennia. The problem with that approach, beyond the profound ethical catastrophe of deciding that some children's lives are worth less than others, is that it rests on a series of assumptions about what superior means that don't hold up under scrutiny. The characteristics Vault 75's researchers were selecting for physical capability, intellectual performance under standardized testing, certain measurable biological markers represent a very narrow conception of human value. The complex, contextual, culturally embedded ways in which human beings actually function and contribute to communities don't map onto standardized metrics. What Vault 75 was actually producing, had it run long enough, would have been a very capable population optimized for the conditions that the researchers valued. Whether those would have been the right conditions for the post-war world, or whether the eliminated inferior genetic lines would have carried adaptations that turned out to be valuable in ways the researchers couldn't anticipate, is something the experiment was never in a position to find out. The genetic legacy of the Vault program is thus not the purified, optimized humanity the Enclave envisioned. It's a much messier, much more diverse, much more interesting biological and cultural landscape. Surface populations adapting to radiation and altered ecologies, Vault populations carrying pre-war genetics into a world they've never seen, and the specific transformations, the ghouls, the supermutants, the mutated fauna that various experimental and environmental pressures produced along the way. Number. Section 22. The recordings and the silence. The terminal logs are the primary historical record of what happened inside the vaults. For most facilities, they're the only record. The people who might have told their own stories are dead or transformed or scattered into a wasteland that doesn't much care about the specifics of where they came from. What remains are the words that people typed into machines, in the before and during and sometimes the very end of whatever their vault experience was. Reading terminal logs in the Fallout games is an exercise in a very specific kind of archaeology. You arrive after the fact. The events are complete. The conclusions, if there are conclusions, have already been drawn or not drawn by people who are no longer able to draw them. You read backward from the result into the process, and sometimes the process makes the result feel inevitable, and sometimes it doesn't. The early logs in most vaults are formal and institutional. Equipment status, maintenance reports, food production numbers. The kind of record-keeping that keeps a facility running and documents its operational health in terms that the engineers and administrators who receive those reports can act on. These logs sound like the vaults were working, because in the early period, most of them were. The environmental systems were functioning. The power was steady, the water was recycled, the food was being grown. The personal logs come later, in the cracks. The moment when someone feels strongly enough about something to type it into a terminal rather than just think it. The complaints about the overseer's decisions. The loneliness of not knowing what's happening on the surface. The fear that the vault's systems are starting to show age. The grief for people who have died and the growing awareness that the sealed world of the vault is both everything and profoundly insufficient. In Vault 92, the personal logs are the most disturbing part of the facility's record. A musician writing about waking up with their hands shaking and not knowing why. Someone else noting that a colleague who was usually gentle has twice become violent in the past week without any apparent provocation, and that the colleague seems more distressed by their own behavior than anyone around them. The mounting unease of a community that can feel something is wrong but can't identify it. The violence when it comes is documented with the same disbelief, the same searching for an explanation, the same horror at what they find themselves doing. Vault 11's logs are more political. They document the voting bloc negotiations with a specificity that suggests their authors understood that the terminal records might eventually be reviewed. The official language is careful. The unofficial logs, when you find them, are raw. Someone explaining to what appears to be a journal entry that they traded their vote for the overseer nomination for a guarantee of safety for their family. Someone else writing that they've made their peace with what they did because the alternative was watching someone they love get elected. The private negotiation of terrible choices. The logs in Vault 87 stop quite early relative to the Vault's later history, simply because the transformation process that the FEV caused eliminated the people who were making the records. Peter Stevens' terminal entries, documenting his growing understanding that his son had been taken and used as a test subject, are among the last clearly personal records in the Vault's archive. After a certain point, the logs are scientific documentation. Observations of test subjects, records of physical changes, measurements of behavioral alterations. The human beings disappeared from the record and the data took over. The Vault 77 webcomic is notable because it provides a record from a vault that doesn't have terminal logs in the game itself, a story rather than documents, and the narrative form allows it to track the psychological deterioration of its subject in real time. We see the man before he opens the box. We see him when he first gives a puppet a name. We see the moment the fictional narrative he's constructed starts to feel more real than the reality around him. And then we see him leave. The silence in some vaults is as informative as the records in others. Vault 12, with its failed door and its irradiated population, left relatively little documentary record because the transformation process was rapid enough that the residents didn't have extensive time to write about what was happening to them. Vault 108's final days, the period when the Gary clones were actively eliminating the original population, are not documented because anyone who might have documented them was running for their life. The recordings that survived are the ones that were made before the end. They're snapshots of moments in the middle of processes that the people recording them didn't know were ending. Someone typing a maintenance report 6 months before the Gary clones killed them didn't know they had 6 months left. Someone composing a musical piece in Vault 92's studio, working through a difficult passage for the 3rd time, was not aware that the white noise was already doing its work. The terminals hold the record of people who were going to die or be transformed in ways they didn't choose, and they hold it in the perfectly ordinary language of people who thought they had a future. Number section 23. What the Vault Boy knows. The Vault Boy is Vault-Tech's mascot, a cheerful, round-faced, perpetually grinning cartoon figure whose thumb is always up, whose optimism is unfailingly expressed. He appears on every piece of official Vault-Tech promotional material. He illustrates the Pip-Boy's status menus. His image is printed on posters throughout the vaults, grinning from radiation warning signs, grinning from tutorial materials, grinning from the official documentation that the residents were handed when they arrived, and that told them they had made it. They were safe. The vault would provide. The Vault Boy knows everything about the vaults, in the way that a corporate mascot knows everything. He represents what the corporation wants you to think. He was designed before the war by people who needed a friendly face to put on a product that was being sold to the population of a country that was terrified of nuclear war. He worked. The vaults sold. The junk bonds were oversubscribed. People stood in lines, sometimes literal lines, to secure their vault spots, paying whatever was asked for the guarantee that their name was on the list. The Vault Boy is still grinning on posters in vaults where the population killed each other decades ago. He's still giving the thumbs up in facilities where the air is full of hallucinogens, or where the water is irradiated, or where 54 Gary clones roam the corridors. The cheerfulness of the branding and the reality of the vault are in such extreme contrast that the Vault Boy's image functions, in the context of all the vault stories, as a kind of continuous dark joke that no one who made him was intending to tell. The Perkins radiation measurement system, illustrated in the Pip-Boy's manual with the Vault Boy holding up fingers to indicate radiation levels from normal to run for your life, is a piece of documentation so deeply embedded in Fallout's iconography that it's easy to forget it represents something specific. A corporation preparing its customers for an environment the corporation knew would be lethal for most of them, providing safety information for a scenario the corporation was building its fortune around. The Vault Boy's most enduring cultural function, in the post-war wasteland, is as a pre-war artifact. Players find his image on old posters, in old promotional materials, on the walls of facilities that no longer serve their original purpose. He's become a kind of shorthand for pre-war America itself. Cheerful, optimistic, unaware of or unwilling to acknowledge the reality of what was coming. The thumbs up in the face of everything that followed. Number, Section 24. The vaults that almost were. The development of the Fallout games has, over the years, produced a significant number of vault concepts that were designed, partially developed, and then cut from their respective games for reasons of time, scope, or narrative fit. These cut vaults form their own parallel canon, documented in design documents, developer interviews, and the occasional unused asset left in the game's files. The Van Buren Project, the cancelled Fallout 3 developed by Black Isle Studios, had an extensive vault roster, including several facilities that were later incorporated into the lore through the Fallout Bible and occasional references in the released games. Vault 29, with its AI-raised children, was one of these. The specificity of those vault designs, the care with which they integrated the experimental concept with the larger narrative context, suggests that the designers were genuinely engaged with what the vault program could mean thematically. Bethesda's development of Fallout 3 reportedly involved the design of several vault concepts that were reduced in scope or eliminated as the game structure was refined. The 6 Capital Wasteland vaults that made it into the final game represent a selection from a larger potential roster. What the cut vaults might have tested, what populations they might have housed, what catastrophes or unexpected survivals they might have documented, exists only in the general direction of the design process that produced them. Fallout 4's workshop system, which allows players to partially design Vault 88, was itself a kind of meta-commentary on the vault design process, putting players in the position of choosing what experimental parameters to set and observing the consequences. The vault's incomplete state, its potential for multiple different experimental configurations depending on player choice, extends the logic of vault design to the player's agency in a way that makes explicit something that's usually implicit. The experiment's design determines the outcome, and the designer's choices determine the experiment. The vault concept, from a design perspective, is almost infinitely generative. You can always add another variable, another constraint, another experimental condition that would produce a different kind of community under different kinds of pressure. The games have explored a significant range of that space, but the theoretical possibility space is much larger. Future entries in the Fallout series will presumably continue to add to the vault roster. Each new game, set in a new region, would have its own set of vaults to document, its own experimental parameters to reveal through terminal exploration and environmental storytelling. The vault program was national in scope. There's a lot of American geography still to be explored. Section 25. The Vaults and the Human Experiment. Taken as a whole, the Vault program represents the most concentrated and deliberate study of human behavior under constraint that any fictional setting has ever conceived. The scale of it, 122 facilities, hundreds of thousands of residents, 2 centuries of unmonitored experimental conditions, represents something that no actual scientific program has ever approached for obvious ethical reasons. What the Vault stories, read as a collection rather than individually, seem to be saying is something specific about the limits of external control as a determinant of human behavior. The Vault program had enormous resources. It had physical infrastructure, psychological tools, chemical interventions, information management, biological modification, social engineering of remarkable sophistication. It could put people in sealed rooms and deliver precisely calibrated stressors and observe the results with comprehensive monitoring. And yet the results kept surprising it. Vault 3 survived its experimental conditions beautifully, and then died the moment it encountered the random violence of the surface. Vault 11's entire population killed each other through the political consequences of a system designed to produce sacrifice, and then the 5 survivors said no, and the door opened, and it turned out that refusing to play had always been the option. Vault 95 produced a community of recovering addicts who had genuinely recovered, and then destroyed them by providing access to exactly what they'd overcome. The surprises are in both directions. Vaults that were supposed to produce stable communities collapsed. Vaults that were supposed to collapse produced survivors who built things. Vault 21's gambling society functioned better than most, until Mr. House disrupted it. Vault 81, should have been destroyed by its own experimental parameters, and instead became one of the most functional communities in the Commonwealth because one researcher made a different choice. The Vault program learned over and over that the variable it hadn't accounted for, the one that kept disrupting its models, was individual human decision-making in conditions of high stress. Not collective behavior, not group dynamics. Individual choices. The researcher who sabotaged the system, the 5 survivors who said no, the one overseer who tried to open the door. These choices weren't predictable from the parameters of the experiment. They emerged from the specific moral architecture of specific people in specific moments. That's what the coffee mug in Vault 11's sacrifice chamber tells you. Someone's specific relationship to their own death, their specific emotional and philosophical resources, produced a specific act. Walking to their execution, carrying their morning coffee, drinking it on the way, setting it down, going through the door. The experiment couldn't design for that. It couldn't predict it or prevent it or use it. It could only record it. The record is what we're reading. 200 years later, in terminals and holotapes and audio recordings, scattered across facilities that have become ruins and shelters and landmarks in a world that the experiment helped create but couldn't control. The Vault program wanted to understand humanity under pressure. What it produced was history, the specific, contingent, impossible to fully predict unfolding of human choices in terrible conditions. That's what history always is. And the Vaults, for all their deliberate horror, are history in the same sense that everything is history. The record of what people did when they had to do something. Number closing. 200 vaults. 200 numbers in the Vault Tech ledger, each one a sealed world, a closed experiment, a community of people who trusted a corporation and a government with the most fundamental thing there is to trust anyone with: their survival. Most of them got something quite different, but most of them also, in some form, survived. Not the vaults themselves, not the communities as they were designed, not the experiments as they were planned. The people. In fragments, in transformations, in descendants who never knew their grandparents had once lived in numbered rooms beneath the earth, the people kept going. That's the thing about the Vault program, that its designers, with all their data and their monitoring and their carefully calibrated experiments, never fully accounted for. You can take everything from people. You can seal them underground and drug their air and lie to them and harvest their children and turn them against each other and fill their water with things they don't know are in it and wake them from their sleep with sounds that make them violent. And they will still find a way. Not always, not everyone, not in every vault. The floors of 100 underground facilities tell a different story, and we've spent these hours walking through some of those floors, reading the terminal logs and trying to understand what happened. But the wasteland exists. People live in it. The NCR and the Brotherhood and the settlements of the Commonwealth and the communities of Appalachia and the Mojave's improbable, chaotic, magnificent mess of competing visions for how to live after the end of the world, all of it exists because some people made it out. Because the Vault program, for all its power, couldn't eliminate the thing it was ostensibly trying to study. The human capacity to keep going is not reducible to a variable. You can't measure it in advance and control for it. You can only observe it after the fact, in the records left by people who were in impossible situations and found something to build anyway. That is, in the end, what every Vault story comes down to. Not the experiment, not the corporation, not the overseer or the design parameters or the carefully calibrated stressors. Just the people, doing what people do. Thank you for being here for all of it. If you've found something in these stories that you want to carry with you, or something you want to explore further, the comment section is yours. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is, and which vault, if you had to live in one, you'd actually choose. And if you want to keep exploring lore, keep diving into the worlds we love, subscribing is how you make sure you're here when the next one opens. Number addendum. Vault secrets deeper down the details. Most players miss. There is a particular pleasure in returning to the Fallout games after you already know the broad strokes of the Vault stories and paying attention to the specific texture of the environment. The Fallout series does something that very few games manage to do with consistent success. It tells its stories through objects and spaces as much as through dialogue and cutscenes. The terminal logs are the primary record, yes, but the physical arrangement of the vaults, the things left behind, the way rooms are decorated and what those decorations tell you about the people who lived in them. All of that constitutes a second layer of storytelling that rewards careful attention. In Vault 11, the sacrificial chamber is not just architecturally distinct, it's furnished. There are items in that room that speak to the attitude of those who entered it voluntarily. Personal effects, sometimes, that indicate a person had time to bring something with them, that they knew they were going, and they chose to bring a small piece of their life into the moment of its ending. The chamber was designed to be used, and it was used, and the physical evidence of that use is preserved in the game in ways that no terminal log fully communicates. The apartments in Vault 92 still have their instruments. A guitar sits against a wall. A piano occupies a corner of what was presumably a practice room. Sheet music is pinned to walls, some of it mid-composition, as though the person who was working on it intended to come back and finish. The unfinished compositions in Vault 92 are perhaps the most specific kind of tragedy the Vault offers. Someone was making something, and they were going to keep making it, and then the white noise did what the white noise does, and the composition sits unfinished and will sit that way indefinitely. The cafeteria in Vault 87 has evidence of the transformation process even in areas that aren't the dedicated research wing. The facility was optimized for the FEV program, and you can trace that optimization through the layout itself. Spaces that should be recreational or social have been repurposed. The cafeteria, where a functional community would gather for meals and conversation, shows signs of having become something else. The FEV experiment didn't just transform the residents, it transformed the space they lived in. Vault 101 has something that many players walk past without registering. The posters and signs in the Vault's common areas, the institutional framing of daily life, are all oriented toward the inside. Nothing in the Vault's communal spaces points outward, toward the surface, toward the idea that there is a world beyond the blast doors. The Vault's culture of interiority, its insistence on itself as the totality of possible existence, is embedded in its decoration. The Overseer didn't just tell the residents that the outside world was uninhabitable. The physical environment of the Vault reinforced that message at every point, directing attention inward, celebrating the Vault's own history and achievements, never acknowledging the sky. The Gary clones in Vault 108, when you encounter them, are not simply hostile enemies in the mechanical sense. They're each wearing a Vault 108 jumpsuit with a number on it. Gary 14, Gary 32, Gary 25. The numbering system, intended by the scientists to track which iteration they were dealing with, is the only individuating mark that differentiates what is otherwise an identical population. The clones can only say one word. They are, in the most literal possible sense, the same person over and over again, distinguished only by a number that was never theirs to choose. The observation rooms in Vault 108, where the Gary clones were supposed to be kept and monitored, show the point at which the experiment's capacity for containment was exceeded. The rooms are designed for observation, for the neutral positioning of scientific inquiry, for the maintenance of distance between observer and subject. The distance was eventually eliminated by the subjects themselves. Vault 112's physical layout tells the Tranquility Lane story in a very specific way. The egg-shaped Tranquility Loungers in the main chamber are arranged to be accessible and unthreatening. They're designed smooth and futuristic in the optimistic pre-war style. But there are more pods than there are residents, suggesting that the facility was planned for a larger population than it received. And there's only one administrative terminal, Bronze Terminal, from which the simulation is controlled. The Vault's physical design makes the power structure visible. One controller, many controlled. In Vault 81's hidden section, the contrast between the working residential vault above and the abandoned laboratory below is stark enough to feel like two different architectural philosophies. The residential vault has the signs of habitation, wear patterns on floors, personalized spaces, the accumulated small modifications that people make to their environment over time. The laboratory is institutional, impersonal, designed for function rather than comfort, preserved in something like its original configuration because no one has been down there to change it. Number. Addendum 2. The economics of survival and the vault supply chain. Every vault required a continuous supply chain to function. Food, water, medicine, spare parts for aging equipment, replacements for failing systems. The closed environment of a vault was not truly closed in the economic sense. It depended on having the right things in the right quantities from the moment of sealing, because resupply from the surface was never part of the plan. Vault-Tec designed supply manifests for each facility, calculated to sustain the planned population for the duration of the experiment. These manifests are a revealing document in themselves. They tell you exactly how much Vault-Tec thought a human life required per unit time, and they tell you that the calculation was driven as much by budget considerations as by genuine assessment of need. The weapons overstock in Vault 34 is documented in the official supply records as a deliberate deviation from the standard manifest. Someone had to approve the additional weapons. Someone signed off on the order that resulted in a vault receiving 3 times the standard armory allotment. The supply manifest is where the experiment's design becomes most explicit. The things that went into a vault were not accidental, they were chosen. Vault 95's hidden drug supply, the room that the embedded agent revealed at the carefully chosen moment, also appears in the supply records if you know where to look. The drugs were there from sealing. The agent knew they were there. The community spent years overcoming their addictions in a vault that was already stocked with the substances they were trying to stop using. The cruel specificity of that design is visible in the supply manifest as clearly as anything in the terminal logs. The food systems in functional vaults were based primarily on hydroponic agriculture, using carefully maintained growing systems to produce crops in the absence of sunlight and soil. The technical sophistication required for this is considerable, and Vault-Tec's agricultural engineers spent significant effort on the design and maintenance of these systems. Vault 22's agricultural research, the work that produced both the breakthroughs and the catastrophe, was building on this foundation, pushing beyond what the standard hydroponic systems could do. The water recyclers, present in every vault and absolutely critical to long-term survival, were designed with significant redundancy. Multiple systems, backup systems for the backup systems, maintenance procedures that could be followed by someone without specialized training if necessary. The engineers who designed these systems understood that the vaults were going to be largely autonomous for extended periods, and they designed the life support infrastructure accordingly. The power systems were similarly robust, primarily geothermal, drawing heat from the earth itself and converting it into electricity through systems that required relatively little maintenance compared to the alternatives. Several vaults are still drawing power through their original systems 200 years after sealing, which represents a remarkable piece of engineering achievement, even when the experimental parameters of those same vaults represent a remarkable piece of moral failure. The medical systems in most vaults included auto-dock machines, automated medical devices capable of diagnosing and treating a wide range of conditions without human medical expertise. These machines, present throughout the Fallout games as environmental objects and sometimes as interactive systems, represent the Vault program's acknowledgement that it couldn't necessarily staff every facility with sufficient medical professionals for the entire duration of the experiment. The Autodoc is, in its way, another piece of the Vault's surveillance and control infrastructure. A medical machine that monitors the health of residents and provides treatment also monitors the health of residents. Every Autodoc session is a record of the resident's current condition, their injuries and illnesses and treatments, maintained in the Vault's central database and accessible to the overseer. Your health is not private in a Vault, it's data. Number. Addendum 3. Vault numbers. And what they might mean. The numbering system for vaults is never fully explained in the games, and attempts to derive a clear logic from the numbers have not produced definitive answers. The numbers don't appear to correspond directly to geographical region, completion date, or experimental type. Vault 76 is a control vault in Appalachia, while Vault 77 is a one-person isolation experiment in an unknown cave. Vault 87 is an FEV research facility in the Capital Wasteland, while Vault 88 is a prototype testing facility in the Commonwealth. Adjacent numbers don't cluster in any consistent way. What the numbering system does suggest is a bureaucratic allocation process. Vault-Tec assigned numbers sequentially as projects were approved, meaning that the number reflects the order in which a particular vault's design was finalized, rather than anything about its location or purpose. This is consistent with how large organizations typically manage project numbers, and it has the effect of making the vault system feel like something managed by a corporation running many concurrent projects simultaneously, which is exactly what it was. Some numbers in the sequence are unaccounted for in the existing lore. Vault 1, Vault 2, Vault 4 through Vault 10, except for specific ones, large stretches of numbers in the middle of the range. These gaps represent either vaults whose stories haven't been told yet in a game, vaults that were designed and referenced but never fully fleshed out, or vaults that simply don't have stories that any released game has found reason to tell. The lower numbers are interesting as potential early experiments. If the numbering system reflects chronological approval, then Vault 4, Vault 7, Vault 8, and similar low-numbered facilities represent some of the earliest experiments conceived by the program. Vault 8, the source of Vault City and its GEC, may have been among the first vaults fully approved, which is consistent with the idea that some early vaults were conceived as genuine shelters before the experimental component of the program fully developed. The higher numbers, concentrated in the Capital Wasteland and Commonwealth ranges, suggest that Vault-Tech's experimental ambitions grew over time, with later designs incorporating more sophisticated and more extreme experimental parameters. Vault 112's virtual reality experiment, Vault 75's genetic refinement program, and Vault 100 and 11's cryogenic suspension all represent technologies and approaches that would have required years of development before they could be implemented in a vault context. The high numbers that characterize these facilities may reflect their late placement in the development queue, approved after the earlier, simpler experiments had already been running for some time. Number, Addendum 4, the vaults in the wider world of Fallout fandom. The Vault stories occupy a peculiar position in the broader Fallout fan community. They are, simultaneously, some of the most beloved and most disturbing content in the franchise, and the combination of those two things produces a very specific kind of engagement. Fan communities have spent years extending the Vault concept, creating elaborate headcanon experiments for unnumbered vaults, debating the ethics and the logic of various vault designs, and occasionally producing deeply moving creative work that takes the Vault template and asks what it would mean if certain variables had been different. What if Vault 92's researcher had come forward and told the residents what was happening? What if the Vault 11 overseer had refused immediately, before any sacrifice had been made? What if Vault 95's embedded agent had had a crisis of conscience like Vault 81's researcher? The counterfactual thinking that Vault design invites is productive in the specific sense that it reveals what the actual choices cost. When you ask what would have happened if someone had chosen differently, you're acknowledging what the actual choice produced, and the acknowledgement carries its own weight. The Vault Boy, as a piece of iconography, has achieved a cultural presence well beyond the games themselves. The imagery of cheerful corporate optimism plastered over horror and experimental suffering resonates beyond the specific context of the Fallout franchise because it maps onto recognizable real-world experiences of institutional dishonesty. The Vault is a corporate product that was sold to its consumers and then used to study them, and the mascot of that product grins from every surface of the facility where the studying is happening. The cultural resonance of that image is not specific to Fallout. The Vault experiments also resonate because they are recognizable as expansions of real psychological experiments that were conducted in less extreme forms by real researchers. The Vault 11 experiment echoes the Milgram obedience studies and Shirley Jackson's short story The Lottery in ways that the game's designers explicitly acknowledged. The Vault 19 paranoia experiment echoes the Stanford prison experiment and various studies in social psychology about how environmental conditions shape individual and group behavior. The Vault 92 sound experiment connects to real research on subliminal audio influence and sleep-based suggestion, none of which produced anything as extreme as the Vault's outcomes, but all of which existed in some form. The Vault program is science fiction, but it's science fiction built from recognizable pieces: real psychology, real institutional behavior, real corporate incentives, real government corruption. The horror is not alien. It's human, which is what makes it stick. Number Addendum 5. Final Vault secrets, the ones that almost never come up. There are facts about individual vaults that rarely surface in the broader discussions of Vault lore, but that are, in their specificity, genuinely revealing. Vault 21's Mr. House didn't just win a lot of money from the Vault's residents before sealing it. He won so comprehensively that the Vault's social system, which was designed to function through the randomness of gambling outcomes, broke down completely. The theory of the Vault's experiment was that a gambling-based dispute resolution system would be fair because outcomes are unpredictable. House demonstrated that with sufficient skill, the system could be predicted well enough to dominate it systematically, which means the experiment also inadvertently measured the limits of randomness-based fairness when confronted with concentrated skill. The boomers of Vault 34, who built their culture around explosive ordnance, have a fascinating relationship to their vault of origin that they probably don't fully understand. Their reverence for bombs and their aggressive isolation from outsiders aren't just personality quirks. Their adaptive responses to the conditions of a vault that was destabilized by weapons, and that opened into a wasteland where the weapons were the most immediately useful thing the vault had provided. The boomers took the tool that had destroyed their community and made it the foundation of their identity. Vault 19's red and blue sections produced residents who, upon leaving the vault, maintained some form of the red-blue distinction in their social interactions. The categories that had been meaningless before the vault's experiment made them meaningful were not easily discarded when those residents returned to a world without the vault's physical partition. The division outlasted the architecture that had created it. Vault 95's embedded Vault-Tech agent lived among the recovering addicts for years before revealing the hidden drug supply. The logs recovered from this facility suggest that the agent was aware, over the years, of specific residents and their specific struggles. The agent attended community events, ate meals with people whose recovery they were going to destroy, and maintained the relationship long enough to be trusted. The deliberateness of that process is one of the more quietly disturbing aspects of the Vault program. It required people who could manage sustained, calculated cruelty over an extended period, without that calculation becoming visible. The gunners who occupy Vault 75 and Vault 95 represent a post-Vault economic reality. Both of these vaults have infrastructure power systems, water recyclers, defensible positions, storage space that is valuable in the wasteland. The gunners didn't inherit the vaults because of any connection to the original experiments. They occupied them because abandoned vaults are extremely useful facilities, and the original residents were gone. In this sense, the vault's physical persistence outlasted their experimental function and became a different kind of resource: real estate. The Institute's use of Vault 111 as the entry point for their retrieval of Sean suggests they had access to vault override codes or physical access mechanisms that shouldn't have been available to a post-war organization. This implies a line of descent from pre-war MIT researchers who either had Vault-Tech connections or who found documentation of vault override systems in the ruins of pre-war institutions. The Institute's comfort with operating inside vault-style sealed environments, their underground campus is essentially a large vault with a rail system, suggests cultural familiarity with the vault design philosophy. Even if their specific institution has post-war origins, Vault 76's best and brightest selection criteria were never made fully explicit in the games, but the population that emerges in Fallout 76 includes people with a wide range of backgrounds and skills: scientists, engineers, farmers, teachers, medical personnel, tradespeople, best and brightest. In Vault-Tech's usage apparently meant competent and productive, rather than brilliant and exceptional. The Vault was designed to be a seed community, not an elite retreat, which meant prioritizing practical capability over prestige. The gold in Vault 79, the actual physical bullion moved from Fort Knox, represents one of the stranger historical continuities in the Fallout world. The concept of a gold standard, of precious metal as the foundation of economic value, is a pre-war idea that the wasteland had mostly moved past by the time of the games. Bottle caps function as currency in most regions because they represent the output of water purification machines and therefore have a direct relationship to survival. Gold has value because people agreed it had value, a convention that a nuclear apocalypse is particularly effective at disrupting. The Treasury Department's decision to move the gold underground anyway, to preserve the infrastructure of a pre-war economic system in the hope that it would be useful post-war, is characteristic of the kind of institutional thinking that defined much of pre-war America's preparation for the Great War. Confident that the structures and systems of the old world would translate meaningfully into the new one, not fully accounting for how thoroughly the new world would transform the terms of value and exchange. The water chip failure that launches Fallout 1 is, mechanically, a simple inciting incident. Something breaks, a replacement is needed, someone goes to find it. But in the context of everything we know about the Vault program, it carries additional weight. The vault that was designed to never open is forced to open by the failure of a machine. The elaborate human engineering of the vault's social and informational environment, the fake radio transmissions, the overseer's careful maintenance of the isolation doctrine, the generations of cultural reinforcement of the vault's self-sufficiency, all of it is overridden by the breakdown of a piece of hardware. The experiment doesn't end because of a human decision. It ends because a chip failed. There is something almost funny about that, in the dark humor register that Fallout occupies when it's being honest with itself. Vault-Tec spent an enormous amount of effort engineering the social conditions that would keep Vault 13's population inside, and ultimately it was the water chip that made the difference. Not the overseer, not a moral crisis, not a collective decision or a rebellion or any of the human factors that the social engineering was designed to manage. A component doing what components eventually do, regardless of what the corporation that designed the housing around it intended. The vaults were built to last. The machines in them were built to last, and they have, in many cases, 200 years later, geothermal power still flows, water recyclers still turn dirty water clean, autodocs still stand ready to diagnose and treat. The engineering is genuinely impressive, but chips fail. Air systems accumulate the wrong compounds. Cloning experiments produce results their designers didn't anticipate. Individual researchers make moral choices that override experimental parameters. Individual survivors gather together and say, no more. And through all those gaps in the machinery of control, the history of the wasteland flows. The Vault program wanted to control the experiment. What it produced was the world. And the world, as always, turned out to be more than anyone planned for. Number, Addendum 6. The sounds of the vaults and the silence between them. There is a specific quality to the ambient audio design in the Fallout Vault levels that distinguishes them from every other environment in the games. The surface wasteland has wind and distant sounds, and the unpredictable noise of creatures moving through ruined spaces. Towns have the sound of people, the hum of generators, the conversations and clatter of communities in motion. But the vaults have their own acoustic signature, the low, constant hum of life support machinery, the hiss of recycled air through ventilation systems, the particular resonance of metal corridors and concrete walls that gives every footstep a distinct, slightly hollow quality. This ambient sound design is not accidental. The development teams working on the vault sections of the games made deliberate choices about the acoustic environment because they understood that sound carries emotional information that visuals can't fully substitute. The hum of the vault systems is reassuring and unsettling simultaneously. It tells you that the machines are working, that the air is being filtered, that the power is on. It also tells you that you are inside something that was built to function continuously without outside contact, something that was designed for permanence, and that you are a long way underground. The vaults are quieter than the surface in some ways and louder in others. There are no weather sounds, no wind, no rain. The acoustic environment is entirely the product of the vault's machinery and its inhabitants, and in the vaults where the inhabitants are gone, what remains is the machinery alone. That specific sound, the sound of a facility running without anyone in it, running because it was built to run, and because no one turned it off, is one of the more melancholy experiences Fallout offers. In Vault 11, the silence in the areas near the sacrifice chamber has a different quality from the silence elsewhere in the facility. The game doesn't do anything mechanically unusual there. The ambient hum is the same. But the spatial design of the area, the way the approach to the chamber is framed, creates a sense of ceremony that the sound design reinforces by not adding anything. The silence before the chamber door is the silence of a place that has been used for a specific purpose many times, a place that has accumulated the weight of what happened in it without any capacity to express or release that weight. Vault 92's audio design, in a game about a vault whose experiment involved sound, is particularly carefully handled. The facility's ambient sound includes very low-frequency elements that players might not consciously register, but that contribute to the general sense of unease the level produces. The records in the vault explain the experiment explicitly, but the design team also chose to make the audio environment itself carry some trace of what the white noise did. Not the specific subliminal messaging, obviously, but a vague acoustic pressure, a sense that the environment is doing something to you that you can't quite name. The Tranquility Lane sequence in Vault 112 has its own sonic character entirely. The simulation produces a completely different acoustic environment from the vault itself. The sounds of a suburban American neighborhood, birdsong, distant lawnmowers, the sound of wind through trees that haven't existed in the real world for 200 years. This sound design is so carefully constructed and so complete that it initially functions as reassuring. It sounds like safety, like normalcy, like a world before the war. The horror of Tranquility Lane is partly the horror of recognizing that these sounds are being produced by a machine, that the birds aren't birds, that the normalcy is manufactured by a person who is using it as a stage set for cruelty. The moment of disorientation when the lone wanderer enters the simulation and hears that ambient neighborhood sound after hours of navigating the ruined, echoing Capitol Wasteland is one of the more effective uses of audio contrast in the Fallout series. The pleasant sound is immediately suspicious because of how out of place it is. And then the events of Tranquility Lane reveal exactly what was being concealed behind the pleasant sounds. In Vault 101, the ambient audio carries the sounds of a community, distant footsteps, indistinct voices, the particular acoustic signature of spaces that are used every day. When you return to the vault during the Broken Steel DLC content, those sounds are different, changed by the events that followed the Lone Wanderer's departure. The vault still sounds inhabited, but the quality of the inhabitants has shifted. The community under internal strain in ways that the audio captures even before the specific conflicts become visible. The Gary clones of Vault 108 don't just say Gary. They say it in multiple distinct vocal registers, each carrying different emotional coloring. A triumphant Gary, an angry Gary, a questioning Gary, what might be a frightened Gary. The game's voice direction for the Gary clones is, in its limited way, surprisingly nuanced. The single word carries as much meaning as the single word vocabulary permits, and the variation in delivery across the different clones creates the impression of distinct personalities constrained by a shared limitation. These are not the same entity. They're different people who can only say the same word. That vocal design makes the Gary clones more unsettling than they would be if they were simply aggressive robots. They're people. Copies of a person, yes, but with enough variation to suggest that the copying process didn't produce identical results every time, that something in the replication introduced differences, and every one of them is hostile. Not because hostility is their nature exactly, but because each iteration of the cloning process reinforced a particular neural pattern, and that pattern expressed itself as violence toward outsiders. Number Addendum 7, the Vault as Metaphor and its long reach. The Fallout Vault is one of the more resonant metaphors in contemporary science fiction, and it resonates because the psychological and social dynamics it depicts are not invented from nothing. They're extrapolations from recognizable human behavior in recognizable institutional contexts, pushed to extremes that reveal what those behaviors are doing at lower intensities in everyday life. Every institution that seals people inside its logic, that controls the information its members receive about the world outside, that maintains its own authority by making the outside world seem threatening or uninhabitable, is doing something that Vault 101 does explicitly. The Vault's overseer recorded fake radio transmissions to keep people from wanting to leave. The versions of that practice in actual institutions are less dramatic but structurally similar. Information management that makes the outside seem dangerous, authority that rests on the community's belief in its necessity, the manufactured consensus that there's no good alternative. Every workplace or community that creates in-group and out-group dynamics through seemingly arbitrary distinctions, that manages the paranoia those distinctions generate by giving people partial information and slightly different versions of events, is doing something that Vault 19 does explicitly. The Vault's red-blue division was meaningless in any objective sense. But once people organized their lives around it, it became meaningful. The meaningfulness was real even though the original distinction was artificial. Every recovery program that puts recovering addicts in an environment controlled by people who know where the substances are and have their own agenda regarding when those substances become available is, at some level, telling the story of Vault 95. The power dynamic between the people who know what the environment contains and the people who are subject to that environment is real, whether the environment is a sealed underground vault or something less architecturally dramatic. The experiment as shelter, the institutional promise that conceals the institutional reality, the authority figure who knows the truth and manages the fiction. These are not science fiction constructs. They're social patterns that vault text designers recognized from observation of real human behavior and amplified for experimental purposes. The amplification is what makes the vault stories feel like horror rather than social commentary, but the social commentary is there. The Gary clones of Vault 108 can be read as an extreme parable about the limits of replication. You can copy a person, template by template, and what you produce is not that person. The specific neural patterns that made Gary who he was don't survive the copying process intact. Each iteration diverges more. The copies are recognizably derived from the original. They all say the same word. They're all violent. They all wear the same jumpsuit with a different number, but they're not the original, and they're not the same as each other. Identity is not reducible to template. Something in the original is lost in the copy, and something new emerges that wasn't in the template. In a broader sense, the Vault program itself can be read as an attempt to copy pre-war humanity into the post-war world. The sealed gene pools, the preserved cultural knowledge, the specific experimental conditions designed to produce adapted and capable survivors, all of it was an attempt to take something from before the war and reproduce it after. What emerged from the vaults was not pre-war humanity. It was something new, shaped by the specific conditions of the copying process, which in this case included 200 years underground in various states of experimentation. The post-war world of Fallout is not a reconstruction of the pre-war world. It's something genuinely different, produced by the interaction between what survived the bombs and what the bombs and the 2 centuries after them did to what survived. The NCR is not America. The Brotherhood of Steel is not the US military. The Institute is not MIT. These things carry the DNA of what they came from, but the DNA has been through enough to produce something that their predecessors wouldn't fully recognize. That's the Vault program's actual legacy, and it's also the legacy of any catastrophe that a civilization survives. The survivors carry the past forward, but they can't reproduce it. The past is always already changed by the experience of surviving it. The vaults were built on the premise that pre-war humanity could be preserved and then restored. What they actually produced was a collection of origin stories for something new. Something that will never be what it was, but will always carry what it was inside it, alongside everything that was done to it and everything it did to survive. That's the Vault program in full. Not a preservation project, not a set of experiments finally. An origin, a chaotic, often terrible, sometimes remarkable set of beginnings for a world that came after. Number. Addendum 8. The geography of forgetting and the geography of remembering. There is a reason that explorers in the Fallout games often describe the experience of entering a vault as stepping into a kind of time capsule. The vaults were sealed. The world outside them moved through 200 years of transformation while the vaults sat still, or moved through their own internal transformations that were largely uncorrelated with whatever was happening on the surface. When you open a vault and walk inside, you're walking into a preserved moment that is also, simultaneously, the site of everything that happened after that moment. The geography of the vaults is very specific in the way that the geography of meaningful places tends to be specific. You remember which hallway leads to the cafeteria. You remember which door goes to the overseer's office. You remember where the first body is, the first indication that things went wrong, and the sequence of subsequent evidence that tells the story of how wrong they went and how fast. The vaults have the kind of spatial memory that attaches to places where significant things happened, the way you remember the layout of a house where something important occurred long after you've forgotten other details. The geography of forgetting is the other side of this. Outside the vaults, in the wider wasteland, most of the social history of the pre-war world is fragmentary. People know there was a war. They know approximately when. They know that the world before the war was different from the world after. But the specifics, the daily texture of pre-war life, the particular institutions and customs and beliefs that organized American society before the bombs, are present in scattered pieces rather than continuous memory. The vaults contain continuous memory. The terminal records, the holotapes, the physical objects preserved in sealed rooms, the architecture itself, all of it constitutes a kind of institutional memory that the surface world largely lost. When players explore vaults and read the records, they're accessing something that the wider wasteland doesn't have, the specific, documented history of specific people in specific places during the specific period of transition from the pre-war world to the post-war world. That's why the Vault stories feel so different from the surface stories in the Fallout games, even though both types of stories involve exploration and combat and environmental storytelling. The Vault stories are about a moment that is still present in the physical space, preserved in amber, waiting to be understood. The surface stories are about the long aftermath of that moment, the world that grew from its wreckage. The Vault is where the before and the after meet. It's the hinge point between the world that was and the world that is. Walking into a vault in the Fallout games is always walking through that hinge. Into the sealed time of the experiment, the preserved crisis, the moment that has been running ever since it began, and then walking back out into the wasteland that the vaults helped build. Number, Addendum 9. The Weight of Numbers. 122 vaults. That number bears repeating, because sitting with it for a moment changes the scale of everything else in the Vault story. 122 sealed underground communities, each one an experiment, each one a set of people who trusted an institution with the basic terms of their survival. At a conservative estimate of around 500 people per vault, some vaults were larger, some were much smaller. Vault 77 had one resident and a crate of puppets. That's approximately 60,000 people who went underground, trusting that the vaults were what they were advertised as. 60,000 people whose lives became data points. 60,000 people whose communities became experimental chambers. 60,000 people whose descendants, in the rare cases where there were descendants, built the wasteland. The scale is enormous when you hold it that way. It isn't 60,000 characters in a story, it's 60,000 actual human lives within the fiction of the Fallout world. Each one specific and irreducible. Each one containing within it everything that any human life contains. Family and memory, and hope and disappointment and routine, and the small daily business of being alive. And every one of those lives was, from the moment the vault doors closed, subject to an experimental condition they did not choose and did not know about. Vault-Tec designed the experiments with the precision of people who cared about the data. They cared about it so much that they were willing to treat the people generating that data as resources rather than as human beings. That kind of caring, the caring that is really about the output rather than about the people producing it, is not unusual in institutional contexts. It tends to be what happens when the machinery of an institution grows large enough that the people inside it stop being visible as individuals and start being visible as numbers in a system. 60,000 numbers, and behind each number a person who went underground expecting to come back up. Some of them did. The ones who came back up built the world. The ones who didn't, who were transformed, who were killed by the experiment's parameters, who died in the long years of waiting in the dark, left their marks in the terminals and the holotapes and the spaces of the vaults themselves, specific and irreducible even in their silence. Every vault you explore in the Fallout games is also a cemetery, a monument, and a library simultaneously. The dead are present in what they left behind. The survivors are present in what they built when they got out. The experiment is present in its results, in the factions and creatures and cultures that the vaults produced and sent out into the wasteland. 122 experiments. One enormous world. And all of it traceable, if you know where to look, back to the moment someone at Vault-Tec decided that understanding how people survive extreme conditions was worth putting people into extreme conditions to find out. The finding out is still happening. In the rusted corridors and the glowing terminals and the living communities and the ruins, the vaults are still telling their stories to anyone who walks inside and pays attention. They always will be. The Fallout vaults were, in the end, built by people who believed that knowledge was worth any cost. That if you could understand how human beings function under pressure, the information gained would outweigh whatever was lost in the gaining. The vaults represent the outer limit of that belief, the point where it stops being a research philosophy and becomes something else entirely. Something that the people inside the experiment would have had a very different name for if they had known what was happening to them. The vaults stand as a record of what institutions become when they stop asking whether the knowledge is worth the cost and start assuming that it always is. That assumption, held quietly inside the warm, cheerful branding of the Vault Boys' perpetual thumbs up, is the beating heart of the entire program. And it is, in the end, the thing the wasteland was built from. Knowledge purchased at the price of 60,000 lives. The experiment that became a world. Good night.